4, 3. Okay, I think we're live. So, alright, hello everyone in the internet verse. It's me, Jackson. Also, I'm here with Long Story Short. How you doing?
Doing pretty good. Appreciate you chatting with me.
Yeah, well, I do always love a good talk. I don't get a whole lot of talks on the interwebs anymore. Makes me kind of sad. I used to have there used to be a bunch of like creationists who wanted to talk to me, but now I can't get any of them to talk. But from your video, I don't gather that you're a creationist. I don't think.
Um, yeah, I describe myself as I'm open. I'm open to evolution being true. In fact, I'd actually prefer it if it was. It'd make a whole lot of things easier. So I'm open to it, but I'm not convinced that the confidence that it's put forth with is totally justified. So whenever I talk with anybody, if I'm talking to somebody who's religious or somebody who's irreligious, um, I anytime I get a sense of a pretense of knowledge, I don't like it when they do that. So any kind of lazy thinking or lazy logic or arguments that are accepted uncritically just because somebody on my side said it, I don't like that. So
Mm,
um, I don't like
understandable.
it when religious people do it. I don't like it when scientists do it either. So that's kind of the position that I'm coming from right now. So I'm open to whatever might be true.
Okay. It seems, uh, from my watching your video that you've been reading Stephen Meyer.
Yeah, so the brand new YouTube channel that I just made, just kind of as a side project that I'm doing, and the first one was kind of a pilot, just a proof of concept type of thing. And yeah, the just as a starting point, I thought I would see if I could summarize, this 400 or 500 page tome in like 6 or 7 minutes. I think I did an okay job at capturing the gist of the arguments without being too reductionistic. Um, but as you and some of the other commenters point out, in focusing on brevity and humor, you do lose a little bit.
Well, that's
So
gonna
there,
happen with any YouTube video anyway. Is
right,
no
yeah,
one's gonna. I mean, if you make an hour-long video about one topic, you're gonna lose people, and if you make a 5-minute video about one topic, you're gonna lose people. So that's the internet.
yeah. People will complain either way, but if you have the time and inclination to read like a 400 page, semi-technical book, you read the book if you want the whole story. But for the majority of people who don't, if you want to kind of a little peek into it, maybe to whet your appetite,
Hmm.
I think that it's at least a good place to start the discussion.
Okay, yeah. Um, I guess I have one question first. I know you said you have questions, and
Mhm.
I hope we get through all of those. In I guess in deciding to look at evolution, why did you choose Meyer as the first place, or is he the first place that you went, or is he kind of
Oh no,
a step along the way?
no, I've read Coin's work. I've read some of Dawkins. I've read much of Behe's work, Meyer, some others in the ID movement that I don't think are as good a starting point. So I'm sure you're familiar with some of the work. On whatever side you are on this discussion or other discussions, there's some who appeal more across the aisle, so to speak, and there's others who, you're only going to like this guy if you already agree with him. So I feel like Meyer's work is some of the most fair to both sides, even though he does press his point pretty bluntly. He's not rude. He's professional about it, and he
Sure,
presents the
sure.
arguments, I think, pretty fairly. And he's pretty meticulous. Um, so I thought it would be a pretty good starting point for that, at least eh, compared to some of the other places that I could have started.
Sure, sure, sure. I think you're right that there are. Yeah, I think like Denton, for instance, is probably more of the is like I'm already right, so ha. But
Yeah, yeah.
when it comes to my, I'm not. Well, I'm not exactly sure meticulous is a word I would use, and we could probably get into why later. we laid out a bit in the video of why.
At least relatively meticulous compared to some of the other places. Is that fair enough?
I mean, perhaps. In doing
Okay.
research for the video, I didn't read his entire book. As you said, it's a tome.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I had essentially to use like find, and so I would scan through the book and go, and then like read several pages of. It's like, okay, here's this word. Okay, let me read about what is he saying about this topic. Okay, now he's on to a different topic. So, okay, what's the
Yeah.
next subject I'm looking for?
Did you find online the online? There's like the entire text that's
Oh yeah,
searchable. You
yeah,
found that? Okay.
yeah.
That's pretty helpful.
bok.org
Yeah,
is what I
something like this.
use.
It's all like completely plain text. It's kind of hard to read, but it's all there.
Yeah, yeah. There's some great websites out there for just finding books open access, and
Hmm.
so yeah, that was kind of how I had to go through that. Cause it's like, okay, either read a. It's like, do I need to read the entire book? You know, it's like, okay, well, if he talks about this subject for 10 pages, I could read those 10 pages
Yeah,
and
yeah.
get the argument. So
Yeah, a lot of it is narrative. A lot of it, any of these kinds of papers and arguments can be boiled down to a sentence or two. Um, so yeah, I think that's fine. Not a lot of people have a half a week to sit down and devote to a book like that.
yeah, um, okay, yeah, we can get into more of that later. So yeah, your questions. You said, I mean, this is really more for. This is about you. So go ahead.
So first of all, I wanted to thank you for your cordial response, your cordial dialogue so far. Most of the comments that you get on topics like these are going to be trolls or people who are rude or not helpful or say things that both sides would just say like this, just a ridiculous kind of thing, that kind of comment. So I appreciate your willingness to actually engage with the arguments. I said like 1, 2, 3, and then you said, well, here's the answer to 1, here's the answer to 2, and here's the answer to 3. And I was like, wow, that's great. So that was very helpful, particularly a lot of the papers that you linked. I was able to look up maybe 70-80% of them. A couple of them are behind paywalls.
Ooh,
I
I
didn't
can
think it
help
was
with
worth
that after. It's like I can help with that afterwards if you want.
it. That'd be cool. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with how all of the academia paywalls, all their things. Some of them were available free, some weren't. So it's very helpful, that kind of thing. So when reading like Meyer's work, there I would look at a lot of the critical reviews of that, and sadly a lot of times the majority of the reviews, like almost all of them, they wouldn't really address his main points. They would attack other things, and it was not helpful in examining, hey, is Meyer making a good argument or is he making a bad argument? So the dialogue that we've had so far, I think, has been helpful for me.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I really do try to foster conversations about these. That's why I always ask people. That's why I tend to ask people if a creationist or ID or whoever is commenting on a video. I say, hey, why don't you? I don't like texting out a long response because I also don't like reading long responses, and so it's like I'd much rather talk
Yeah.
about this. Then we can hammer out the points,
Yeah.
the most important stuff. So
And each comment gets longer and longer and longer, and then
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so yeah, much easier to just talk to people screen to screen, you know.
yeah. So I guess a good place to start is maybe some of your comments on the video that I had initially, and then I did take time to go through both of your videos. I have like 10, maybe 13 pages now of notes. It's up to 15 pages. So I don't think we need to go over all of that. Maybe just on the highlights, and we
Okay,
can maybe use that as
sure.
a starting point. One of the first things you said Meyer put forth some gross misunderstandings in his work.
I think it does. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's good. What could you list some of the more egregious ones, or maybe some of the obvious ones that I could look into?
Well, for instance, he completely skips the small shelly fauna. I think that's one of the big issues. He doesn't. He kind of try. My friend RJ has this thing called xenoslicing, which is basically where you take different topics and you really separate them out such that nothing really connects with anything else, and they each seem as
Right.
like separate little unconnected data points. And
Okay.
so, oh yeah, we have a from the commenters. Ooh, goody notes. So I'm glad that you took notes. We are glad that you took notes. That's one of my big things. Or that was one of the main things that I tried to harp on in the first video was
Hmm.
how this is a logical progression. How it's not just bam over here, bam over there. Oh,
Right.
complexity. That's like
A
that's
lot
not at
of
all.
kind of disjointed different things, and you don't really get a sense for how things fit together.
Right. That's really
Hmm.
so with regard to that part, and also the phylogenetics. He really skips over the phylogenetics. Meyer does.
Do you mean like the like he doesn't really look into cladograms and cladistics and that kind of stuff?
From what I could tell, when he's discussing, I mentioned the examples of. So of course, one of his main points is the Burgess shale. Like in your video, hey Chuck, I found something.
Hmm.
Um, it's like, oh, there's this huge burst of complexity just out of nowhere. It's like, okay, where do these organisms that are in the Burgess shale fall with regard to other organisms? Um, and from what I could tell of Darwin's doubt, from the parts that I was looking, it didn't really seem like he was trying to connect the dots. Um, we mentioned Pikaia, for instance. He mentions Pikaia like once in the body of the text,
Hmm.
if I remember correctly. Um,
Yeah, there were a couple of things that you mentioned in your videos. Pagayan was it Metaspergina or
Metaspergina,
something like.
yep, that's
Yeah,
another one.
yeah.
Which I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I had a paleontologist friend who says your pronunciations of taxa are weird, but
Well,
he said he liked the video overall. Um,
there's at least they watched it.
yeah, right. Yeah, at least he watched it. But yeah, if you look at Pikaia and Metaspergina, these guys are basal chordates. They're kind of right down there at the bottom of the chordate tree, uh, which seems pretty transitional to me. Another example was Hallucigenia and Ishaya. And Hallucigenia he mentions repeatedly throughout the course of the book. It's like 10 times.
Hmm.
But at no point does he say, oh, by the way, Hallucigenia is here at the base of the Panarthropod tree. It's right here next to the Onychophorans and the arthropods and the tardigrades. And it has some of these characteristics which link it to these groups, but it's still more primitive, which is exactly what technical literature does. When you find a new fossil, you're like, oh, all right, well, let's examine this and see where it fits.
Hmm.
Is it part of a modern clade? Is it a stem group?
Hmm.
Stuff like that. And that I didn't really see much of that. He did kind of talk a little bit about the history of it.
Hmm.
Alcott grouped everything in modern phyla. Like
Hmm.
Morella was just a lace crab. It's like,
Right.
no. you know, uh, but
Yeah,
we,
he talks about the I think he calls it the lumpers and the splitters
yeah,
who try
yeah.
to like trump up the difficulty of the Cambrian explosion or kind of play it down.
Right, and then as with everything, modern phylogeny is a bit of both. It's
Right. It's a
uh,
little bit of subjective.
sure. I mean, taxa names are arbitrary, anyways. I mean, when you say something's a chordate, well,
Uh-huh.
we're just talking about things with a notochord. Cool. What is the evolutionary bearing of that? Right.
Can I ask you a quick side question?
Oh,
I was
sure. Go
watching
ahead.
one of
Sorry.
your other videos, and you mentioned something about Sonic the Hedgehog, and I didn't know if you were joking. It sounded like this was some
The Sonic Hedgehog gene.
Sonic. Okay, it was a gene. Okay, what?
It's a
That's
Hox
a real
gene.
thing.
Are you familiar with the Hox gene? I think
Yeah,
Meyer
yeah.
talks about them a little bit, doesn't he?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
So yeah, so the Hox genes regulate ontogeny, and Sonic Hedgehog is one of them because it was studied. It was a lot of our Hox genes came first from studies in fruit flies, and they
Yeah.
noted how it. I think that's the one that gave the fruit fly little bristles on
Hmm.
its
Hmm.
body or leg or whatever, and so they went. It looks kind of like Sonic the Hedgehog.
So whatever scientist was working with this particular thing, whoever saw it first gets to name it. Is that sort of how it works?
Yeah, that's the zoological nomenclature and gene nomenclature. There are literally books of rules on how to name things
Uh-huh.
and stuff, and so it's with yeah with generally with genes, it's the stuff that happens when you turn it off is what they name it, like the gene eyeless.
Hmm.
If you turn off eyeless, then it makes the fly
Interesting.
eyeless. So
Right. I've read about that. That is interesting. So I assume that this biologist just was a fan of Sonic and just stuck that in there. That's funny.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's not, I mean, scientists have a sense of humor. I mentioned in one video, or we mentioned, the turtle Ninja Me's, which is named after the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Wow,
It's
that's
a
funny.
Yeah, it's a turtle, a Meolaniid named after
Uh-huh.
the what do they say in the paper? An epitome, or like a reference to the fearsome foursome epitomizing shelled success is what they say in the technical paper. So, you know.
I'm sorry to sidetrack us.
Oh
Okay,
no, you're
so
fine.
we're talking. I find that to be just very interesting. So some of the gross misunderstandings is what we were talking about. Are there any others that so these seem to just be more oversights rather than gross misunderstandings? Is that a more accurate kind of description of it?
I think not exactly. Some of it is
Okay,
like I think the things that we mentioned are more misunderstandings rather than, or sorry, are more oversights rather than misunderstandings.
okay,
I
okay.
think what he says about like the Wistar uh, symposium and his what he says about proteins, because I've actually brought up his points with protein biologists and they're just flabbergasted by the numbers he mentions, like his the odds of a functional protein fold are there it is. Ninja, an allusion to that totally rad, fearsome foursome epitomizing shelled success. Thank you, Nestle. His work on, or his arguments regarding protein evolution are just baffling. For instance, have you ever heard his
Once we
argument?
get to the super large, like 10 to the whatever giant
Yeah,
numbers.
yeah. He
Okay,
says, it's 1 in 10 to the 164th, and we picked that number apart in one of my videos. It's like,
right,
how the
right,
heck did he come up with this number? And
right.
it's so that is misunderstanding. Kind
Okay.
of trying to figure out the original suite of proteins based on modern proteins is kind of a misunderstanding. The way that, or
Mhm.
based on the modern like amino acids and things, this is sort of a misunderstanding. And we talked to a protein biologist, and he's like, it's very complicated work. You have to figure out which of the amino acids are the like original set, which ones are more recent, as in billions of years, additions, things like that. And so that's kind
But
of a
is that the view that some of the difficulties that we would calculate today, that where some of these large numbers come from, um, some of the more ancient proteins would have been more pliable or something like that?
right. The amino acids that contributed to, and see, I don't even really enjoy talking about abiogenesis all that much because it's such
We don't have to get into
a
it if
far
you want
side
to.
issue. Well,
Right, right, right.
right. I mean, the brief overview is that yes, there are many differences. There are many things you have to consider when doing that sort of research, which they do take into account, which don't really accord with what Myers says they do. And so there's really a big disconnect in that as far as that research goes.
Right. Yeah, I think the origin of life stuff is definitely kind of its own separate can of worms.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Um, I think some of the numbers are more rather than how do we get from no organisms to some organisms. Rather than that, it's how do we get from these simple organisms that are in the fossil record to these far more complex ones. How many new proteins would it take to get from X to Y, for instance?
Uh,
So I think that's where some of those come from.
yeah, I mean, even still, that's talking about probabilities as far as evolutionary biology is concerned is, in my opinion, oftentimes extremely problematic. I mean, of course, there are whole fields of mathematics research within evolution, like population genetics. That's just all math. But it's it's complicated because you have, and as we alluded to in the video, there are millions of factors you have to take into account to try
Sure.
to figure out these. It's like, okay, what are the odds of any particular gene being duplicated? Might be one in like 3.2 billion or something like that. It's like, okay,
Hmm.
well, but it happened.
Hmm.
Okay, it's. I mean, obviously, we can talk about the probabilities of this sort of thing occurring, but if it happens, then it's kind of. I don't really see the purpose in talking about the statistical likelihood of it.
That does make sense. So if we know, if we know that something did happen and we know the cause, then it's kind of a foregone conclusion. But I think the argument that's made oftentimes is that that's the very question that's trying to be asked. And if we try to use something like the mutation rate studies and that kind of thing that assume from the get-go that it did happen, well, and since it did happen, it had to happen at this rate. That's the very question that we're trying to ask. A
Well,
lot of times, at least some people are
sure.
trying to ask, at least.
Well, sure.
Is that fair enough?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So those rates are determined using modern experiments. Typically, you can look at either populations in the wild or populations in laboratory experiments, and you can figure out the rate at which they're mutating.
Oh, sure, yeah.
You can look at, you can do. We know what the mutation rate of like DNA polymerase is. It screws up every one in however many billion nucleotides. But we also have to remember that it's not random necessarily. There are other factors at play. There might be things that cause more mutations to occur, or things that cause less mutations to occur. There might, as Nestle points out, the problem is that there are many genes in each organism, and that there are as many organisms in each species, and there are many species. Yeah, even if it's improbable that there will be one specific gene. Yeah, which is. But yeah, I guess to get back to your question, you have people who study these things in the wild and in the lab, and they work out these rates. And we use things like molecular clocks to figure out at what point did these two species split, and and when you look at a bunch of different molecular clocks, it helps to kind of paint a picture.
Right, and I'd like to get more into molecular clocks and some of the rate studies in a little bit too, if we can. I don't want to get too sidetracked again.
Sure, that's fine.
You just said it's not random. There's different things that can change the rates of mutation.
It's not totally random.
It's not totally random. Okay. I'm just trying to
There is an element of randomness to it, but it's not always totally random.
Okay.
Some things are very good at duplicating
and by
genes.
it, do you mean the rate of mutation or the
Yes.
mutations themselves?
The mutations themselves. Mutating is not always totally random. Some organisms are more likely to duplicate genes than others, things like that. Like plants are very good at whole genome duplications. They do that a lot.
So the mutation is done intentionally?
No, it's not intentional. I mean, there are factors within the genome that might cause certain mutations to happen, or might increase the likelihood of certain mutations happening. There is still an element of randomness to it, but it's still largely random. But there are other factors that will influence it.
There's factors that make mutations more likely, yes. But the word mutation itself seems to indicate that something didn't quite happen properly.
Well, it depends on what you mean by happening properly. If you have a mutation, there are studies on the fitness effects of mutations. You can have a mutation which very slightly increases the beneficiality of some feature in you or on you, and well, now that's going to confer a selective advantage. And so now you're going to pass that to your offspring, and and other mutations might come along later, which open up new adaptive pathways. And I mean, you have to look at, if you look at specific examples.
Right. So which organisms survive isn't totally random. There's certainly selection taking place, but the mutations themselves that come about, what's the mechanism that causes those mutations? Certainly that's random, and there are things that increase or decrease the rate of mutation. Right? It's a point mutation or deletion or something like that, right? Okay. I just want to make sure we're on the same page there. There wasn't something that was making these mutations happen so much as changing the rates, making them happen more frequently or less frequently. But when they do happen, they are still random. Are we on the same page?
Yes, in large part they are random. Yes.
Okay. So how I kind of look at all of these things. So evolution is just incredibly wide and deep. subject. There's no way that anybody can be an expert in all of these fields. Even one of these fields
Sure.
to become an expert takes a very long time. So I kind of get the sense that you do something similar to what I do. Reading sections of things, reading the pertinent things, in particular reading critical reviews of of these works. So I wanted to ask what were some of your if you did read any, what were some of your preferred reviews of Meyer's work?
I mean, they what's his name? Well, Donald Prothero penned a review a long time ago about the book. If you just look at, I don't remember the whole name, but if you look up Donald Prothero, he's a paleontologist.
I'm familiar with his review of it.
Okay, well, I mean that's one I haven't read. I mean, other than that, I haven't read. I didn't rely on his review of it. I went in and I watched your video, and I looked up the relevant sections in the book. I didn't rely on anyone else's review of it.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Or we weren't piggybacking really off of anybody else except our own stuff.
Okay, yeah, that's fair enough. I was just trying to see if you knew of some some sources of reviews that that I could take a look at. That would help. No, yeah, I'm familiar with Prothero's reviews. There's a whole bunch of them. There's what I found to be even more instructive in helping kind of sort out some of the issues. Particularly what was the issue and what wasn't the issue. What was the argument, what wasn't it? Was the follow up to Darwin's Doubt
By Meyer.
No, there's a follow up to that by Klinghoffer debating Darwin's Doubt.
Yeah.
It's not quite as thick as Darwin's Doubt, but it's almost. It's like 300 or 400 pages instead of 400 or 500 pages. Meyer and his colleagues go through all the different reviews and not all, many of the reviews and kind of this is what they said and here's our response, and it's very instructive.
Okay.
I found that to be very helpful. If you'd like to take you certainly don't have to look at all of them. Some of the chapters are much more helpful than others. But a lot of what you brought up was, I felt like very, very roundly, very soundly answered in a lot of this work. Particularly Donald Prothero's review. A lot of the other comments about the small shelly fossils and Ediacaran fauna and that kind of thing. All of that was, at least seemed to be, very roundly answered. I'd like, at some point in the future to talk more about that if you get a chance to look at one or two of those chapters. So we can talk more in detail.
So did he talk about the small shelly fauna in?
He does in Darwin's Doubt, and they talk about it in even more detail in the book Debating Darwin's Doubt, the follow-up.
I mean, Klinghoffer's another ID proponent. So, I mean, but right. You're looking at
he works with Meyer at the same place that you. So
neither of whom are paleontologists, but with the Cambrian explosion, it seemed like from looking through his work is that he didn't really touch on these, or at least from what I could see, maybe he did, but it really didn't seem like he touched on these issues, because when you look at the Cambrian, when you look at what paleontologists are saying about the Cambrian explosion, nothing about it seems weird or special. It doesn't seem any weirder than any other adaptive radiation in Earth's history. And I mean, I mentioned like the mutation, or the speciation rates are not even unusual for an adaptive radiation. Nothing about it seems weird. It's very strange to kind of capitalize on this one. It's like, oh, here's this one adaptive radiation. It just seems kind of odd, because it is very logical, and in its progression, you have the small soft-bodied organisms for a long time. Then you have larger soft-bodied organisms. You have your first shelly critters, and then you have the larger hard-bodied organisms later on. I mean, nothing about that seems counter-evolutionary.
Can I give you a couple of quotes from Irwin and Valentine in Science?
I mean, I've read Valentine's work. On the Origin of Phyla.
No, from the Cambrian explosion. Their more recent 2013, I think, book.
I mean, you can, sure.
Well, just to show that people like Meyer and Klinghoffer, whatever their current views, um, it seems to me an intellectual shortcut to say, well, he's an intelligent design guy.
Well,
I don't need to
I'm
take
not
him too.
writing him off because he's an intelligent designer. I
Okay,
mean, like I said, that's why we grappled with the arguments in the first place.
okay,
If I just wanted to say, well, he's just an intelligent designer, who cares? Then I would have never. I mean, I wouldn't have gone to the trouble of making a whole video about your video.
okay, okay. That's fair enough. I don't like it when people do. Have you ever had a chance to like talk to somebody like a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness or something like that?
Yeah, yeah.
So frequently, when I speak with them, if I present any evidence that contradicts what they think, they'll say, "Well, that's just anti Jehovah's Witness, or that's just anti Mormon, and I don't need to think about that." So I I don't like it when people say, "Well, oh, he believes this, therefore I can't look at his reasoning." That's not
Like, I didn't say I wouldn't do that.
okay.
I probably
Good.
can take time in the future to do that. I mean,
Right.
it's like I said,
Um,
we went to the trouble of looking at his work so that we
right.
could do the video.
Right. No, I appreciate it. So, Irwin and Valentine, they say, quote, the patterns of disparity observed during the Cambrian pose two unresolved questions. First, what evolutionary process produced the gaps between the morphologies of the major clades? Second, why have the morphological boundaries of these body plans remained relatively stable over the past half a billion years? So Irwin and Valentine, they have at least two questions about the Cambrian explosion. And then science's review of their work says the Ediacaran and Cambrian periods witnessed a phase of morphological innovation and animal evolution unrivaled in Metazoan history. Yet the proximate causes of this body plan revolution remain decidedly murky. The grand puzzle, the Cambrian explosion, surely must rank as one of the most important, outstanding mysteries in evolutionary biology. So that this isn't quotes from like ID people or
No, I
creationists
get it.
or
Yeah,
whatever. So at the very least, there are some open questions, and
absolutely.
it's not
I
like an
agree.
everyday like, oh, it's no big deal type of thing. It's something that's very serious and very strange even to the day. It's not quite as tidily explained away as it might seem, I
Well, I
think.
mean, sure, we're talking about an event that happened half a billion years ago. We were looking at it half a billion years on, trying to figure out what the heck was going on here, and there are a lot of clues as to what was going on in that time period.
Hmm.
You have, as like we mentioned in the video, you have uh, things, you have organisms eating other organisms, like the little boreholes in Cloudina. You have
Hmm.
predation going on. You have if evolutionary arms races. There was in addition to an increase in oceanic oxygen levels. There's also the stratification of the water column. There's loads and loads of things that are happening right around this time, and they're all feeding into each other.
Right.
And you've got this complex ecosystem forming. And I mean, I don't. It's like I said. I don't particularly think it's super mysterious. I mean, you do have a lot of the. You do see a lot of disparity. You do see a lot of. You see the radiation is mainly in the hard-bodied critters, the guys who are relatives of arthropods
Hmm.
and things like that. The chordates are kind of small, but they don't really take prominence until the next period, the Ordovician.
Right. So, but to simply say that something like you said, no paleontologists consider anything about the time to be problematic.
Well,
I,
problematic, no. I mean, for evolution, not really.
Well, right, in the sense that, like, yeah, they still, Irwin and Valentine, they still believe in evolution, certainly,
I
but
mean, all the
problematic in the sense
paleontologists.
that, oh, right,
Sorry, go ahead.
um, in the sense that these are unanswered questions, and the current models don't do a good job of addressing them yet, and that's why they're
Depends on what you mean. That's why there are different. That's why there are various different hypotheses. They have a pretty clear picture of what was going on as far as like the biota It seems you have you have the kind of the removal of the Ediacaran fauna, and that's a question. Okay, why would the Ediacaran fauna? Why did they phase out at the very start of the Cambrian? Why did the small shelly fauna kind of take over? And then why is it the animals suddenly became super prominent? I mean, that is a question. Those are fair questions.
Okay.
But like I said, I don't think to say it's a fair question and to say it's problematic are two different things. I
Sure.
think it's kind of
I
non
think
sequitur.
to say that, to say that there is no problem is not fair, and to say that, well, there's a problem and this disproves evolution by itself. And I don't think either one of those is fair. I think that there's enough nuance there to leave open for discussion.
I mean, it's sure. I mean, it's kind of like wherever there are questions in evolutionary biology, and there are lots of questions. I one of the places uh, that people like Meyer and Klinghoffer and Denton, all these ID guys tend to go is, well, this is a mark against Darwin. It's like, no, it's not, just because we don't know. But that's kind of where they tend to shuffle their readers is look at all the failings of Darwin, even though Darwin's been dead for over a century. But it's like a century and a half. But
Picking on a dead guy, that's not fair.
exactly.
So to go back to one of your comments, you said once you acknowledge that the roots of these various animal phyla are within the Precambrian. I want to see if you could clarify. What do you mean by roots? Do you mean the small shelly fossils and the Ediacaran fauna, or do you mean something else?
So this kind of harkens back to what I said earlier. Phyla is kind of an arbitrary term. I
Right.
mean, all the texts are kind of arbitrary terms for constantly evolving populations. But what I'm referring to with the animals, so we don't really know what most of the Ediacarans are. Like, what the heck are rangiomorphs? What the heck are they? Get out of here. But we know, like, Dickinsonia, Cambarella, those are probably animals, if not bilaterians. So bilateria's been around for quite a while by that point. The phyla themselves, like, Chordata goes back to the early Cambrian. The porphyrians, the sponges, they go back like 600 million years or so. I think, of the earliest fossils of sponges. Like you mentioned, Schopf found, what was it? Wasn't Duchantois, was it? I can't remember. They're all those Lagerstadt, and I can't keep them straight. I had it all straight in my head when I wrote the script, but it's like afterwards, I'm like, oh wait, which one was that?
Yeah, it's been more than a day. I've wiped it from memory. Yeah.
But yeah, we have sponges and nidarians that go back up into the Precambrian, so we know that these guys were kicking around since then. And when you look at there's research with the genetic toolkit of the metazoans that probably goes back like 800 million years, definitely back into like the cryogenian. That's what I meant by that. Their phyla, a lot of the more basal animal phyla, sponges, nidarians, ctenophores, these guys go back into the Precambrian. Their origins do.
So a lot of these arguments, they seem to be, they sound good on the surface, but just beyond that, there's so many questions that get brought up. Notably, a lot of the Ediacaran organisms, they don't have obvious heads or mouths or even bilaterian symmetry. They don't have a lot of these things that you're saying. At least it's highly contested that they do.
I mean, sure, most of them. Yeah, we just have no idea what they are.
Right. Particularly, I think Dickinsonia, it's even questioned whether that was even an animal or not.
Not so much anymore. That's been pretty much all the papers I've seen regarding Dickinsonia, at least since 2015 or so, have been like, yeah, it's probably an animal.
Okay. I'd like to see that if you want to send me.
Sure. I mean, heck, just Wikipedia or Google Scholar. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It's good places.
But to say that small shelly fossils in the Ediacaran fauna are the roots of the Cambrian
Oh,
animals
I'm not saying they are.
well, I thought that's what you were at.
No, the
That
no
was my
the
question.
no the no the roots of these groups are based on molecular clock data, are in large part. What you do with fossils is you figure out, okay, it has to be older than this, because this is what. I mean, obviously, if it's a member of this group, then the genetic toolkit for this group has to be older than the organism. But it's molecular clock data, which is how you figure out when this group started, but it's bracketed by paleontological data.
So what are some of the problems with this genetic toolkit and the molecular clock arguments?
I'm sorry?
What are some of the problems with the genetic toolkit argument and the molecular clock argument? What are some of the problems with those?
I'm I mean, you can get conflicting clocks, but the more data that you incorporate, the clearer the picture becomes. I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm not. Molecular clocks are great. We use them for all kinds of stuff. Um, but yeah, I'm not. I'm not arguing against them. If it came across as that I was, I'm not arguing against molecular clocks. That they're very useful.
No, right. What I'm saying is they're not the kind of panacea that
Oh, absolutely. You have to.
sometimes
Oh,
there's
absolutely. That's why you bracket with paleontological data, and that's why you have to look at multiple molecular clocks. If you look at just one gene, that might give you a different one than another one. That's why you have to look at a bunch of them to kind of get a concordance of dates.
okay. We can come back to molecular clocks in a little bit. Sorry, I keep getting sidetracked. I'm asking you about the
Oh
roots
no,
of,
you're
of
fine.
the.
You're fine.
So basically, the point is each one of these arguments, on the surface sounds good, but the more I look into any one of them, the Ediacaran fauna, they're essentially unrelated. They're to the animals that come in the Cambrian. They the small shelly fossils. They're at best questionable. They really have very little to do with the Cambrian explosion.
Well,
The molecular clocks, they have all sorts of problems associated with them. So all of this added up that
well,
doesn't really
it's kind of
add up
wrong
to
though.
much.
It's wrong. I mean, your first premise was wrong.
Okay.
When you assert that we don't know, or that the Ediacarans are essentially unrelated, nobody knows what they are. You can't assert that they're unrelated if we don't know what they are. I mean, like I said, we know what a few of them are, like Kimberella, and please include a link to your guest channel. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, I was gonna put that in the description afterwards, but to try to help with feed. Yeah, well, part of the question is what the heck are the Ediacaran fauna? You
Mm-hmm.
can't just assert, well, they're not related to anything. Well, we don't know that.
No, right.
That's the problem.
With a few exceptions, there what the experts that I've read are, they couldn't have been ancestral to the Cambrian phyla. So
I'm not
there
saying they
are a
were
couple of
ancestral necessarily, but
okay.
I
So
mean,
how does that how is that an answer then? How is that a response to it? How is the question that is raised, the problem of the Cambrian explosion any less?
well, if you, again, it's like I said, it's not so much. This isn't so much of a problem as it is a question.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's right. There was just recently another Ediacaran, or another Ediacaran form, which is a bilaterian, Yelingia, that was just discovered this past week, or just described this past week. But just because we don't know what they are, we don't know what they are, or a lot of them. But again, this doesn't really impact evolutionary theory as a whole. This still seems like we do have some of the organisms nailed down. Again, it
Mm-hmm.
still seems fairly evolutionary. As I don't see anything really against evolution there. I mean, you're right. Some of the small shelly fauna haven't been identified. Some of them have, though. Like, some of them are definitely the remains of arthropod relatives, or echinoderms. or corals, things like that. It's not
Mhm.
like they're all just big question marks.
So at the very least, the claims that I'm trying to make are at least I think are very modest. It's the problem with, first of all, the I think there's like two or three main arguments that Meyer makes is, the Cambrian explosion is real. It's not simply an artifact of the fossil record. There's a number of experts that he quotes to support that. Um,
Sure, I agree.
okay,
Sure.
okay, fair enough. And I forgot where I was going with that. That's okay though. The length of the Cambrian explosion. This I think is kind of a minor point, but at the very least, the majority view seems to be that the length of the main um, diversification of body plans was, yeah, at most 10 million years.
It depends on
Some will
what you
say,
consider the main point, though.
well,
Because I was
most
looking at
most of the experts, I think, Erwin and Valentine say, at the most 10 million. I think they say 5 to 6, at the very most 10. I can get the quote if
I mean, I was looking at this in the paper, the very papers that I cited for, or that we cited for the video.
right.
Yeah, yeah,
So
it
the
very much
papers
depends on
that
how you,
say, 25 or 30, or some say as much as 80, they include time periods that are outside of where the morphological changes are taking place.
well, the
Again, I
papers that
think
I seen didn't.
it's a minor point whether it's 10 or 25 million years, but it's not a false thing to say that, experts believe that it was about this short period of time, and they say that it was, geologically sudden, it's
Hmm.
abrupt, it
Hmm.
was a real thing. So I'm just kind of trying to make sure that we're on the same
No,
page
I
there.
agree that it's a real thing, but it does very much depend on when you classify, because the Cambrian radiation is, from the papers I've seen, it's actually two different radiations together. You have the radiation of stem fauna at kind of the beginning, and then there's an extinction of many of the stem fauna, and then you have an explosion of the crown fauna thereafter. So
Hmm.
it's really these two different ones, which is why I'm very cautious when you say it's this was the main one. Well, there were two of them going on, and they kind of one gave rise to the other. Uh, even still, um, I mean, yeah, the morphological transitions were happening, like I said, 25, 30 million years. That's just within the Cambrian. I mean, that's not even the entire Cambrian period. Uh,
Right. So we're not talking about like stage one, stage two, stage three. We're just talking about the 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 the, the stages the the stages where the majority of the morphological innovation happens. Um,
right. Which, yeah, is, like I said, 25, 30 million years. But even
but
still, even granting the shorter time periods, I quoted a paper in my video by Bruce Lieberman, who points out that the speciation rates are not unusual. And we quoted another one, I can't remember the name of the other one, but it's in the description of that video, where we discussed, or that pointed out, even if you compress all the arthropod phyla into the Cambrian, you're still not. It's you still would have a relatively elevated rate of evolution, but nothing implausible. It's not unusual, the speciation rate for an adaptive radiation, which is what I mentioned earlier.
right. So I guess to get back to the problems with some of the molecular clock things and the rates and all of this.
Well, did what I
So
say made sense before we
yeah,
move on?
yes. Um, so but basically what I did, I went through, both of your videos and looked up the claims that you made and look up a lot of these papers, and they seem to be just like citation bluffs, and I don't.
I mean, I cited all of my work in
No,
the
they're
description.
legitimate. No, maybe that means something different to me than it does to you. Legitimate citations, real papers. I'm not saying like you made up any of the papers or anything like that. But what the papers were saying, what the papers were claiming, was sometimes different than how it was
Can you give
portrayed.
me an example?
Um, I'd have to flip through my notes.
Because I'm very curious about that, especially when sometimes I had to read the papers. I had to read through the paper to
Yeah, some of
find,
these
okay,
are very long and dry to read.
yeah, technical literature, it can be very dry. But I mean, it was that in addition to other books that I've read on the subject. Like I said, Valentine's the origin of phyla.
Okay, I see it, I think. At 1430 in your video, you said the rates of evolution weren't even unusual. So if you want to see a more complete,
I
I
mean, I
can kind of give
cited
you a
two different
snapshot.
papers on that one point.
No, right. I'm about to talk about that. So chapter 30 in the compendium to it, the debating Darwin's doubt, if you want more, but I can kind of give you a summary of it. But it's still, essentially what they say, methods for calculating the rate of change, they don't establish the cause of the change in question. And that's the question that I'm asking. The Lee and colleagues, they assumed that natural selection and random mutation was responsible for the change that occurred, and then they simply asserted that natural selection could produce the rate of change that they measured. So that seems to be just, they're simply begging the question rather than demonstrating that the neo-Darwinian
That's
mechanism.
it's kind of missing the point. The point is the speciation rates. I mean, to say, oh well, if you already acknowledge that this time period happened, but you say, okay, well, even if you say we're not sure that natural selection could cause this, you've you've already kind of given the game, though. The speciation rates are, we already agree this time period happened, and we have these fossils demonstrating the different branches on this phylogenetic tree. So here's the speciation rate that we calculate based on that. It's very weird to kind of think of that we accept the time period, but we don't accept anything else about it. I don't really understand that argument.
Well, the question is the mechanism. I think that's kind of the underlying question.
No, that's a separate question. The question of the mechanism. No, I agree that the mechanism is a good question, but that's not the speciation rate question. The question is of the speciation rates, and what these papers were doing was talking about the speciation rates, not the mechanism. The mechanism that's a totally separate issue.
Right, but saying that natural selection could have done this because here's these studies that talk about the rates of evolution, they were not so far above average that it would be unusual or it's out of the question. That's assuming that this did happen.
Does Meyer not assume that the Cambrian explosion happened?
No, that's not what I'm saying. That's assuming that they're begging the question of the rate of morphological change rather than demonstrating that the neo-Darwinian mechanism has the creative power to generate that novelty.
What do you think is the neo-Darwinian mechanism?
Random mutation and natural selection. In
you
short,
think that's it?
Well, I'd be happy for you to correct me if I'm wrong. There's more to it, but that's in short.
Yeah, I mean that's my issue with this argument is you're right. You do already kind of assume that this time period happened, that these organisms appeared at the time that they happened. The mechanism isn't really the question here. The mechanism is a separate question. Or I would say the mechanisms, there are probably a bunch of different mechanisms contributing to this one time period, but that's a separate issue. That's not the speciation rates. The speciation rates are assuming that our time period is correct. It's not really a question of the mechanisms.
Okay, so that is the question that I'm asking, and that is the question that Meyer and many of these others are asking.
What was the mechanism or mechanisms?
Right, so how could the neo-Darwinian mechanism account for this change? So if you grant that it happened, then yes, the rates are X, Y, and Z. But if you don't grant that it happened, how could random mutation and natural selection account for that kind of morphological novelty that quickly? Is there joinder? Does that make sense?
It's like sure. I do want to point out that the question really isn't then the speciation rates. The question is still the mechanism.
Well, yeah, yes, to be fair. So the question is, pointing at these
how does evolution generate these forms, right?
Right. Basically. So pointing to speciation rate studies doesn't demonstrate that it happened. It demonstrates
I agree.
If it happened, this is the rate. So okay,
right, I agree.
That's page there.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Well, this is. I mean, it is in essence asking, how does evolution work? And there are loads of mechanisms. There are. We do know mutations. I mean, you can observe in modern populations mutations generating novel structures and
such as
The frickin' Ragavalia, which is a water strider. Actually, that one wasn't observed. They looked at the genus Ragavalia, and a bunch of species which within this structure, within this genus, have these novel propeller fans, whereas others don't, and so you can pinpoint the origin of that that mutation which causes the structure, and you can do that for. But so I guess then you do accept that species are that like within this genus, all the species are related to each other, right?
I'm not familiar with Ragavalia.
It's just a water strider.
Okay.
So I mean, I'm just saying within this water strider, would you say that this water strider genus? Would you say all the species are related to each other?
For the sake, like I don't know about it, but I can say sure. Just so you can continue your point. Probably. Is that fine?
In a relative sense, okay. So
Okay. Sorry. Sorry. I'm not trying to be difficult. I don't know anything about it other
no, it's
than
fine.
what you're telling me. So I'm taking what you're telling me.
Okay, so the point with this is, what that means is, within this genus, this species or this mutation occurred, which caused a novel structure. And if we agree that all these species are related to each other, because we know how we can do genetic paternity tests on them in essence, where we figure out, okay, these are all members of this species is related to this one, and also to this one, and also to this one. What we are forced to acknowledge is that this mutation occurred in the past, which generated this new structure for this little group, right? Which is just a few species right now, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So that is a mutation generating a novel structure. And there are other examples. You can look at a garter snake genus Thamnophis, which had a mutation. Actually, well, we mentioned that one in Darwin's Confidence Part 2, which has the resistance to tetrodotoxin because they're in an evolutionary arms race with the rough-skinned newt Pterica. And so a few members of this species or of this genus Thamnophis have gartered. Sorry?
What was the name of the snake?
It's Thamnophis. 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 So
Okay.
the garter snake has developed independently within this one genus. Several species have independently developed resistance to the tetrodotoxins of this newt, the rough-skinned newt.
Okay.
So that's. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm not familiar enough with these two, but those are two good examples. I'll definitely look into them. I appreciate that.
I mean, you can follow any line. Even within humans, we've observed mutations that have been beneficial. Like, have you heard of the apolipoprotein A1 Milano mutation?
Mm-mm.
In this
Say
family.
that again. Let me write it down.
Okay. Let's see. Apolipoprotein. Let me spell it out. Okay. APOLIPOPROTEIN. Apolipoprotein. And A1 Milano. So, with this mutation, what it caused was this one guy back in the 1800s, I think, is an Italian guy. He has this mutation which lowers the chance that he's going to get heart disease. He's going to get heart disease. So he got this mutation back in the 1800s. They pinpointed the exact geneticist, genealogist, whatever, have pinpointed the exact person who had this mutation originally.
Really? That's cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. So he had this mutation, which lowers the probability that he's going to have heart disease, and he's passed this on. So now there's a whole family in Milan, Italy, which now has this mutation. And so yeah, we can see that mutations and variations generate diversity. Back in Darwin's day, he didn't have access to decades of genealogical studies, things like that. So he was looking at he saw there were variations, and these variations were capitalized upon by the environment, so natural selection, and those who were fit enough to survive survived. Right?
Okay.
Gazelle with sufficiently fast legs could outrun the lion, while the ones who had shorter legs couldn't, and so they died off. Right?
Sure, that's
extremely
axiomatic.
basic. That was what he thought.
So So I don't know enough about these three examples to speak of them intelligently right now, but I will look into them. But I am familiar enough with these kinds of examples to guess, to make an educated guess of what's likely going on, and I'd be very interested to see if that pans out, and you can do the same if you like. These kinds of adaptations, these kinds of mutations are more often than not due to deleterious things happening, like with antibiotic resistance and that sort of thing. So
No,
there is a
it was a gene
survival.
duplication in the
Okay,
Ragavalia.
there's essentially there's it's taking existing information, either blunting it or breaking it. Is Behe's argument
Yeah,
about it?
yeah, I'm aware.
So
It's a very contrived argument. He very much cherry picks his examples.
we can say that about molecular clocks and a lot of these other things as well. So
In what way, though? I mean, if you're saying that, um, I mean, it's very curious to me. The whole argument about the Cambrian explosion. It's like, well, I'm kind of confused. So please do help me with this. Um, how is it that, on the one hand, yes, it happened half a billion years ago, but we're not. But you also believe that there had to have been some sort of divine intervention to it. Is that wrong?
that's not what I'm arguing. What I'm arguing is it possible to is it possible to detect design in nature?
Theoretically,
Just
I think you probably
theoretically,
could.
yes. Okay. Um, so if there was a situation like if there was a dead body somewhere, and there's multiple hypotheses, he might have been murdered, it might have been natural causes, it might have been suicide. If somebody investigating that rules out any one of those options before looking at the evidence, then that might lead him down the wrong path.
Sure,
You follow?
sure, I agree.
So in order to make a sound inference to the best explanation, we need to be able to look at the evidence before we rule out any of the possible explanations. So
Mm-hmm.
if it's an old person and they're in bed and they're dead and the door's locked, et cetera, then it's probably natural causes. But if somebody has their wrist slashed, maybe it's suicide.
Mm,
But if they have like 19 stab wounds in their back, natural causes is probably not the most reasonable explanation.
I agree. Yeah, sure.
So if we see things that are like that, wherever they may be, I have to think what is the most reasonable explanation. Is it reasonable to think that the amount of information required for, I know that was something that you had an issue with. I wanted to ask you about that. Um, the amount of information required for these new body plans in such a short period of time, is it reasonable to think that the Darwinian mechanism could account for that in that period of time? Um, what I can see is no, but obviously I might be misunderstanding something. So that's the question.
Well,
If the Cambrian explosion is real and it happened in such a geologically brief period of time,
mm,
and so much novel information had to be generated to have these new creatures, what's the best explanation of that? Does that make sense where I'm coming from?
I mean, yeah, I hear I hear you. Can I
Okay.
ask, why do you consider the diapsid radiation at the start of the Triassic to have been designed also?
I don't know enough about that one.
Okay, if Stephen Meyer wrote a book about the diapsid radiation, um,
I mean,
the
I'm
I,
not a paleontologist. I don't make any pretense
I mean, neither is Meyer, but
of being a
well,
paleontologist.
okay, well, let me put it this way. This seems to be a very cherry picked example of design event, because as you correctly pointed out, there is there are quite a few questions, not necessarily problems, but there are questions regarding this time period. We don't really have those questions regarding the origin or the radiation of mammals at the start of the Cenozoic, or the radiation of diapsids at the
Okay.
start of the Triassic. It seems like it's a very, of the many radiations that there have been throughout life's history, it seems like a very cherry picked example. It's like,
Okay.
Would he look at the the dinosaur radiation and say, well, that must have been designed also?
Can I continue with my my clumsy
Oh,
analogy
I'm
to
sorry.
kind
I'm
of
sorry. Go
help
ahead.
you? No, 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 no. You, I didn't want to. I wasn't saying you're interrupting. I was just, I'm following you, and I want you to see kind of how I'm seeing it, and maybe that'll make sense. So why the Cambrian explosion and not some of these other radiations is what I'm thinking. So to continue the analogy, like if we found a dozen dead bodies, and 10 or 11 of them are not suspicious, clearly suicide, clearly this, clearly that. Um, we don't need to spend a lot of time looking at those. But if there's one, um, and we're the working theory is natural causes, but there's 19 stab wounds in the back, that's a pretty big problem. Does that make sense? So let's just grant that the diapsid and all of these other radiations, let's just grant that those happen exactly how you said. That doesn't, what does that do to diminish the problem of the Cambrian explosion? Does that,
I mean,
does,
I
does my
hear
thinking
you.
make sense?
Oh yeah, sure. I'm just.
Okay.
It seems like, but it's like you've already granted that natural selection, sexual selection, all the, genetic drift, gene flow, all these things have occurred just fine, generating novel forms for
I don't,
500.
I don't grant that.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's why it's like, why pick out this one Why pick out this radiation when there is actually a lot known about it? Not everything, obviously, by any stretch, but there is a lot known about it, and it all seems pretty natural in the same way that every other radiation, like the diapsid radiation, was natural. We know that there was an extinction event in the Permian, and suddenly there are all these niches for diapsids to fill, and they
Okay.
fill them.
Okay. Yeah.
It's
So
just
why pick this one rather than some of the other ones that have happened?
yeah.
Um,
Even when yeah.
because this one seems to be the most clear. It's most clear for people on both sides. It's very well
Is it
studied.
though? I mean, we're having this conversation right now, so it doesn't seem very clear.
Well, it's as far as I know, the period of time when the most new body plans have generated most suddenly.
um,
Is that fair enough?
I'm trying to think. Well,
So like back to the analogy, it's 19 stab wounds versus all these other bodies that might have one or two. Like maybe one or two stab wounds in the back could be explained by natural causes. Like
well,
maybe something sharp fell on somebody's back, like an icicle or something.
right. Well, let me. Even with the groups, I see what you're saying. Even with the groups that do appear in this time period, the the example, even the examples that are supposed to be like the best examples show an evolutionary progression. Like if you look at the panarthropods, if you look at a phylogenetic tree of the panarthropods, it's there are very many showing a very gradual progression of traits. You have a group, you have these fossils with um, well, they have some of these parts, but they also lack others. And then you have another group that has a few more
Hmm.
traits, characteristic of arthropods, and then a few others, and a few others. And we actually showed a couple of those phylogenetic trees in the video, or in the first video, which are showing these transitions. They're showing, yeah, there are a lot of them. There are a lot of these forms, uh, but it's also you can also see the progression. If you look at the chordates, also the very first chordates in the record are these small little lamprey like.
What do you mean you can see the progression in through cladistics?
Yeah, you have like hallucigenia and ishai at the
Mhm.
base of the panarthropod tree, and you
But
have
are you aware of all the problems with those explanations?
with cladistics.
With the explanations of how cladistics applies in answering the question of the Cambrian explosion.
Cladistics isn't answering the question. Cladistics is how a tree does not answer um, how these things came about. This only shows how they're related to each other.
Right.
It
So
has nothing to
what?
do with the mechanism.
Right. So if Meyer's entire question, if my entire question is
Well, do you see my
how,
point though? This isn't a question. The cladistic the phylogenies are not showing why this is happening. This is only showing what's happening, but what you're getting is a stepwise progression of these organisms. Regardless of what the mechanism is, it certainly seems like there's a stepwise progression. Why hallucigenia, and then later Anomalocaris and Morella, and then later the true arthropods? Why do we have to have this whole step by step by step by step system if it was designed?
Well, that's a good question, but it's a theological question.
It's not.
Like,
As far as
why,
biology is concerned, it's not a theological question.
well, if you say, why would we see this if it was designed? That is a theological question. Why? We're talking about motivations of some designer.
Which is why it doesn't look designed. It doesn't look designed because you have these step-by-step progressions.
But do we? There's we have all these ghost lineages and characters evolving, then being lost, then coming back again.
Characters evolving and being lost. I'm not sure what you mean by that. I mean, if we look at the chordates, for instance, the very first chordates are these very primitive basal guys like Pacaya, Metaspergina, Hycoichthyes, and then you get the first fish, or you get the first jawless fish, and then you get the first jawed fish, and then you get the split between ray-finned and lobe-finned fish, and then the first tetrapods. That's very gradual and stepwise. So I mean that looks very evolutionary. These stepwise sequences look very evolutionary.
Right. On the surface, though, in that on the surface, it's a very convincing argument. But the second you look at the details, the histories are conflicting.
What histories are conflicting?
Between the different cladograms.
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
You're saying it shows a stepwise evolution, from less complex to more complex. Broadly that's happening, let's say. But that's not really what we see. These are not smooth intermediates. These are things that have highly conflicting trees.
Most of them, no. That was one of the things that I pointed out. Man, I wish I had these papers on, just like on Access. Well, it might take me a moment, but yeah,
I feel like we're getting we're getting a little bit off.
Okay, well, whatever you want to talk about.
How much time do you have? I don't want to take too much of your time. It's been about an hour.
I mean, we can if you want to cut the stream, we can definitely do that.
Okay, I've got time. I don't want to get too much into the weeds. I kind of want to stick to the main topics if we have time, or if you want to talk more later. And I'd like to talk more about cladistics and what does it answer, what doesn't it answer, what are the strengths and what are the problems. I'd like to talk about that more, but I think that would have to be a separate discussion that I would prepare a little bit more for.
I mean, we can certainly, but I think you're a little confused perhaps as to what phylogenetics does. Phylogenetics is just about organizing the organisms.
Right.
It's about showing who is most closely related to who. It does not at all answer what the mechanism for anything is. Right. And it kind of seems like you're sort of tying these ideas together when these are separate things.
I'm agreeing with you. So I'm untying them. I'm trying to untie those. So my question, and Meyer's question in his book, is what accounts for this? How can we explain this on neo-Darwinism? How can we explain this? And if we're talking about things like cladistics that you and I both say don't explain this,
because they're not supposed to. It's not the point.
Right. It's like talking about the color purple. How does purple explain it? It doesn't. It's not related.
Well, I mean, it's related in the sense that you're trying to explain how these groups came about. Actually, here's one of my. Let me see if I can screen share. Do I even know how to do that? Is that gonna break my screen?
I think you should be able to, Unzen.
Okay, can everyone see this? Okay, can you see that on my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one of the images we showed. This is what I'm talking about. You have tardigrade. This is the panarthropod tree, right? So you have tardigrades, you have Diania, which is Cambrian form, armored lobopodians like Ishaya, which are down here. So you can see there is a very stepwise progression. Here you have the appearance of certain parts. The organisms gain these the compound eyes. They later gain the mouth parts, and then later all these parts. But it's very step-like. None of this. It's not like you have one group over and then just complete complexity elsewhere. It's very gradual. This is just one of them. There was I don't know if it's in this one. No, I don't think it is. Anyways, we showed another one which is even more complex than this. It's showing it's like got dozens and dozens of these sorts of things.
So all of those characters, all of those organisms, where do they appear in? Again, I think we're getting sidetracked, but just to continue your train of thought, just for a moment, the question that comes up is, where do they appear in the fossil record? Do they appear in that stepwise manner, or does Opabinia appear after, something like Radiodonta or something like that? If one is expected to appear before the other, with the morphology that it has, but it appears after, then we have to draw these long ghost lineages. We suppose these are here because this doesn't have this character.
Do you know?
Does that
do you know why they do that? Do you know why that is?
I think so, but go ahead and tell me.
It's because the fossil record is a scatter shot. It's as I said in the video. As I said in the part 1, we're not guaranteed any of these. We're not guaranteed any fossils at all. It's nothing short of miraculous that we have fossils at all, and that we have so many. But they're not all appearing in these nice. They're not always going to appear in these nice little step-like ladders like this, because the fossil record is only preserving like a small fraction of the life that has ever existed.
Sure,
and this is well known among
paleontologists. It's certainly not going to be fossilized. That's
right, and so
certainly.
it's and that occurs with all of life, all throughout the fossil record. Everything from the very first organisms we find in the record all the way to today. All organisms, while they do show, you can see trends like that. They're not always going to appear like that.
Right. So then, does the evidence support the claim that you're saying these appear in a stepwise manner, or does it not?
I mean, yeah, you're finding organisms with one trait, or with one trait of arthropods, but you're also finding organisms with two traits of arthropods, and then you find another one with three traits of arthropods. If this is not evolution? I don't know what else it would be, really, because it seems pretty evolutionary. You've got each of these organisms filling in these kind of gaps, whatever you want to call it, and it seems pretty evolutionary. I guess I'm going to stop sharing now. Go back to the
yes,
page.
It does, but only if you ignore the chronology, only if you ignore what the fossil evidence actually shows. And yes, the fossil record is imperfect, certainly, but if you're going to say that this supports evolution, then we have to have the fossils to point at. Otherwise, this is just a supposition. This is where we're assuming
I was just
common
showing
ancestry.
you the fossils.
Well, you're pointing at the fossils, but not the chronology. That's the problem. The thing that is supposed to be an ancestor actually shows up after in a fossil record.
No, they're not ancestors. None of those were ancestors of anything else. They are branches on the tree. We don't know what the...
Say they're sister groups, then.
Yeah.
The thing that is supposed to come prior to it, chronologically speaking, with character X, is showing up, after the thing that doesn't have that character X. So it's not a clean stepwise evolutionary process that you would expect.
Not in the chronology necessarily, and that's paleontologists understand that. But I'm not talking about the chronology necessarily. What I'm talking about is when you look at these organisms and when you show that you find an organism with one of these characters and another with two, this is forming a continuum. It might not necessarily be perfect because the fossil record is messy, but you're still finding all these organisms who are kind of filling in this whole little this pattern. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in chronological order, because paleontologists don't expect that for everything. So.
Well, they do. They just don't see it. They
Well,
would.
no. In some cases, you can see it. I mean, that's how we predict fossils. That's how Microraptor and Diarthrognathes were predicted, among others. There are lots of fossil predictions out there because the fossil record does in some places match.
Okay, so let's wrap up this section
Sure,
on
absolutely. You're
cladistics
right. You're right.
just briefly.
You're right. Yeah.
So I think as long as we're on the same page, it doesn't answer anything with regard to chronology, right?
Because it's not
intended
to,
right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't deal with the question that I raised, nor the question that Meyer raises in his book. It's a separate topic altogether. Is that?
I mean, it conflicts with his problem that these things are just appearing out of nowhere. If these sort of transitional forms are forming a continuum, that conflicts with the problem, with the posed problem, because the problem really doesn't make it's not a problem then.
So you're saying that cladistics answers these Cambrian animals not having precursors.
Right. Yeah. That is the issue. Not the mechanism per se. That's like I said, that's a number of different hypotheses, but it is still but yeah, not having precursors, that is answered to an extent, not entirely, because they're, what are the ancestors of chordates look like? Well, we don't know because they're a bunch of soft body guys, so they didn't really end up fossilized. Or they might be fossilized somewhere. There might be a few of them, Okay.
But... Okay. So let me see what was the next question that I had. Let me just give me a second.
Sorry, go ahead.
Just to scroll through my notes. You said something interesting in one of your comments. You said, "Please don't bring up biological information. I guarantee that term has no meaning." I'm very interested to know what you mean by that.
Yeah. So ideas and creationists, lots of anti-evolution people have. Not saying you are necessarily, but I'm just saying, in lots of conversations I've had with people, information doesn't mean anything to them. It means absolutely nothing. They say, well, it's like earlier you said, how do these organisms have more information? How do these later organisms have more information than the later ones? We have no idea how much, quote, information that these guys have relative to any other ones. That's you have to define what information is. If I ask you just point blank right now, what do you mean when you say information?
Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm following you. So are you saying that you believe that information doesn't mean anything, or are you saying these people that you talk to don't believe information means anything?
I don't think it can have a context. Certainly it's a word, so it can have useful context. But in biology,
it is a word.
But in biology, a lot of times the biologists I talk to don't use it because they recognize that it creates confusion, and a lot of the literature I've read doesn't use it because it creates confusion. So that's why I'm asking you, when you say the word information, or when you read Meyer, what do you think he means, or what do you mean? Either one works.
I don't want to summarize his work.
Okay, fine. What do you mean by it then?
I'd have to pull up a quote, because when we're talking about definitions, I think it's important to be precise.
Absolutely, I agree.
But working with a common, whatever definition you would give to information, I think I could, just for the sake of this discussion, being imprecise, I think we could probably agree. If we have organism A and organism B, one without compound eyes and one with, would it be safe to assume one has more biological information than the other?
I wouldn't say so. They just have different information.
Okay. Does an algae...
See, it kind of depends, doesn't it? Depends on what you mean by it.
Okay. So does an algae contain more DNA information than an elephant, say?
Who knows? It depends on your definition.
Really? That's surprising.
I would say so, because think about this.
That's a very interesting position to hold.
Humans have like 21 to 23,000 genes, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, the rice Oryza sativa has many times that number of genes. Do you think rice is more complicated than a human, or more complex than a human?
Okay, that's a good point.
Same with what is it? The amoeba. The amoeba has a much larger genome than humans do. Is an amoeba more complex than us? That's a, and so it very much depends on your definition of information. That's why I just say genes or
Okay.
pseudogenes or whatever. I don't use the term information.
I'm trying to look up quickly if I can find it. Meyer's definition of it, so we can have a working thing to talk to.
I mean, because it's very much used as just a buzzword. So.
If I can't find it, we can certainly move on and maybe talk about that later.
I don't know how much longer do you want to go today.
I've got time if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay. I don't want to hold you on the line. I'll look at that later. That's a good question. Okay, so how do we define information? Okay, if we can get a working definition of that, then we can talk more about it more. Is that fair enough?
Well, I mean, why even use the word? Why not use other words? If I say gene, you know what a gene is.
Well,
we
I
don't
think
have to grapple with that.
The word that or the phrase rather, that's typically used is, rather than just information, it's I think they use CSI, complex specified information. So it's rather than just random digits. It's digital information that does a thing.
I mean, you can have, well, technically, under that definition, then selfish elements are also complex specified information. So
did you say selfish or shellfish?
Selfish genetic elements are also, by that definition, if they do something, then that was kind of the problem with the ENCODE project, is what's doing stuff. Well, a lot of things do stuff. Do they do useful stuff? Well, not really.
Okay, so your tentative position right now, or at least how I tentatively understand you, is we can't tell which organisms have more or less, say, functional information that performs a function.
I mean, that again, that's,
say
that
coding regions of DNA, for instance.
Sure. If I would just say genes, but then even still, that does it really matter? Well, no. Things you consider less complicated or less complex might have way more genes. Okay. I don't know. It's kind of a.
Let's come back to that then. I don't want you to have to
hurt my brain over it. There's smoke coming out.
I'm sorry. Okay, so punctuated equilibrium was one of the first things that you talked about in your video. Is that in your mind a live theory, a live explanation still? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
It's a way to sort of categorize information within evolutionary theory. We did a video on it. I mean, in my video Stasis, it's very much alive. I think one of the major misconceptions people have is, this is an explanation for where the fossils are, the transitional fossils, which, no, it's not. It's not really the point.
So if it's not an explanation, wait.
Well, it's more about trends in evolutionary theory overall. It's like, why do some forms persist for a long time, and then they undergo relatively rapid morphological change, and then you have different forms. But even Gould and Eldridge were like, there are some wonderful examples of phyletic gradualism, like the forams.
Sure.
So,
but does punctuated so the I think what you're talking, why you brought up punctuated equilibrium was, I think you said I said I forget who said it. Somebody said Darwin was wrong in expecting a gradual succession of fossils, but punctuated equilibrium answers that. So what?
Well, it also kind of depends on what he meant by it too. So
what who meant by it?
It depends on what one person means, because Darwin talked about some things existing for a very long time, and something's going, gradually changing. For instance, in his time, they thought Lingula was the same genus from the Cambrian to today. It's probably not the case anymore, but some things exist for a long time. Some things gradually change. Gould and Eldridge were like, well, we don't always see gradual, or we don't often see very gradual, slow change going on. A lot of times it's there's a lot of change as organisms are discovering niches, and then they kind of fill in those niches and they persist for a long time.
I guess my question is, what explanatory value does punctuated equilibrium have over good old-fashioned neo-Darwinism?
Well,
You
again, that's
proposed it
kind
as
of
an answer.
well. Oh no. That punctuated equilibrium. Well, no. In that when I brought it up, I was just saying that that what Darwin expected was phyletic gradualism, which is
Right.
that everything is slow. This isn't really a complete change. This is just an addition to. These are both processes are happening.
What did,
through
I guess
evolutionary
I'll
time.
ask it that way, what did punctuated equilibrium add to neo-Darwinism then?
Well, punctuated equilibrium is more about how there's a lot of it's like I said, like there's a lot of evolutionary change occurring when these organisms first discover these open niches which they can fill, and then suddenly they're undergoing a lot of change to fill these niches, and then they realize the niche, and so they kind of persist in their form. Darwin was more like, well, things are always gradually, slowly changing. Well, for the most part, there were some things he was like, well, they've pretty much stayed the same, or some things might evolve faster than others, but because he wasn't to use Dawkins' phrase, he wasn't a gradual speedist about everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really just another facet of how organisms trend evolutionarily.
I guess I don't see how
eons.
that's an answer.
To what?
So Darwin expected gradualism. Okay. What the evidence showed, at least tentatively, was not that. So Gould and Eldridge, they come up with another idea to help explain that.
In essence, change isn't always slow and constant.
Okay.
Was it basically?
That's what the evidence showed. So we expect, gradualism, and we see something very different, stasis, and then very
Well,
sudden changes.
You have both. You have gradual.
Right. Darwin expected gradualism throughout. Let's say,
Pretty
right?
much, yeah.
Okay. There were occasions where that was not the case. So how do we explain this on Darwinism? Well, punctuated equilibrium explains it, because sometimes there's stasis, and then sometimes there's very speedy change. So that's kind of the definition of it. That's describing what happened. But what does it add to neo-Darwinism? What explanatory value does it have, other than just saying somehow it happened? Because even Gould eventually acknowledged that.
Well, I mean, Gould's a paleontologist. He's trying to explain what the trends in evolution are over time. The question, I mean, yeah, punctuated equilibrium is still gradual, but in a lot of cases, there's still evolution occurring. After all, evolution is changing allele frequency in a population over generations. So you still have evolution, but you're not always getting constant changes, in essence. So it's more about describing the process of evolution. You still get it's more about describing these trends over time. I mean, Gould is an evolutionist, so they're not so much looking to kind of prove evolution to anyone at that point. They're really just saying, this is what we see in the fossil record.
Okay, so punctuated equilibrium does what specifically to answer the problem of the Cambrian explosion?
Well, it wasn't derived to answer the Cambrian explosion.
Okay, so
I didn't also pose it that way. As far as I remember, I don't remember posing it that it was an explanation.
We said Darwin was wrong in expecting a gradual succession of fossils, if I quoted you correctly.
That was more about just in general.
Okay.
That was more over on the whole of evolutionary sequence. It's not always slow, constant change. That was in the sense that he was wrong.
Okay, so there's no additional explanatory value added by punctuated equilibrium.
to the Cambrian explosion in particular, I mean,
Right.
not really. I mean, it's
Okay.
that's. I mean, you can say that there was more of this. There are some fairly. There are still rapid, but evolutionarily plausible radiation, and that's what it is. I mean, radiations generally are you have a whole bunch of diversity coming out of a quote relatively short geologic time period, which is not a short time period biologically. Biology and geology are on two different clocks.
Okay, so the punctuated equilibrium then is off the table as far as I'm concerned, if I'm understanding you properly, in terms of answering the question that I brought up in my video and what Meyer brings up in his book. Is that fair enough?
Well, it was never proposed as an explanation.
It seemed like it was, but if it isn't, well, I guess we can move on. So the let me see what I have next.
I mean, you have fairly rapid. I mean, you have an adaptive radiation, but that's you have lots of adaptive radiations in Earth's history. So
Do you feel like the Cambrian explosion was merely an adaptive radiation, or what was it more than that?
I mean, that's what it seems like. That's what all the paleontologists who study it seem to think. It's just
Or when
another adaptive
Valentine
radiation.
say that the scale of the morphological divergence is wholly incommensurate with that seen in other adaptive radiations. So you can only call it a radiation by stretching the term beyond all recognition.
I mean, if that's his position, then that's not what it seems like from the other paleontologists I've read on the subject. But if that's his position, then
Well, that's Irwin and Valentine, the authoritative source from their Cambrian explosion book that you suggested that I read.
I mean, yeah, that is one. I know, like I said, that is one position on it. So
Okay.
it wasn't the only one I suggested, but that was one of them.
So I want to ask you, so something that I see that I find very frustrating, very interesting in religion, in science, and all sorts of different things is, whatever happens, whatever evidence comes up, it's just exactly what we expected.
I don't think that's the case at all in this instance. I mean, I've said repeatedly that there are questions. There are things that are not understood. That
No, not understood. What are some things that would falsify evolution or falsify neo-Darwinism in your mind?
that would falsify neo-Darwinism.
Right, because
I mean,
a few times in watching your videos and reading
again, it kind of
literature,
depends what you
and
mean by
it seems
neo-Darwinism.
like, no matter what evidence comes up, it says, well, this is just exactly what we expected, even if it seems like it's obviously, this is the opposite of what was expected, but they did explain it after the fact. So that seems to be pretty frustrating.
I mean, there are examples where they did not expect something, but later they go, aha, or later they go, oh, this is the reason why this happened. But
Right.
but I mean, if it wasn't a prediction, then it wasn't a prediction. They have to figure out why it happened because it didn't happen the way that they thought it was. They thought it was going to happen this way, but it didn't happen. So why didn't it happen this way? Oh, well, there's this other explanation which explains this. I mean, there are examples of specific predictions made by evolutionary biologists that have come true, but then of course there are other things they were wrong about, and they had to figure out why they were wrong. That's how science progresses.
No, that's fair. I think it's good to be humble enough to say, hey, I missed on this one, and we're updating things. But what are some things that in your opinion would falsify Darwinism?
Well, I mean, if it didn't seem like mutations. Well, if there, I guess let me put it this way: if anything were actually irreducibly complex, if anything, I mean, not just irreducibly complex today, but if its history could not be broken down into, gradual, or well, not even necessarily gradual, if it couldn't be broken down into changes that were occurring over, over time, being selected for or not, genetic drift. If these sorts of things can't explain some structure, well, that would be a pretty good argument against evolution.
That's interesting.
And
Okay.
that's that's Behe's whole shtick is the flagellum.
Right. That is he kicks that real hard.
You know
Okay,
he does
that's
not.
interesting. So I agree. If anything were irreducibly complex, that would be a pretty big problem for Darwinism. Okay, what else?
Uh oh yeah. Nestle puts in the chat, dogs producing non-dogs. That's another one. If organisms just wholesale produce different organisms, uh, if a monkey gave birth to a human, that would evolution would be pretty much dead at that point.
Would
Or
it?
if a dog gave birth to a cat, evolution would be dead at that point. So it's like, how the heck would you, explain that one?
Would it really? I mean, isn't that, not those specific examples, but isn't that quite literally what Darwinism claims? One animal over
No,
time
no, 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 no,
gives,
no.
obviously not literally, but the great 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 grandma of this animal gave birth to a dog, and that, or a wolf or whatever, and then it
No,
wasn't that.
no. It can never. You can never not be your ancestry. We're still chordates. Yep.
No, right.
You can never. No, nothing ever gives birth to a fundamentally new thing ever. That never happens in evolution. That everything is just modifications of the old thing. Like humans are, we're descended from Australopiths. We're still Australopiths. There was never at any point where an Australopith gave birth to the first Homo,
Are we
right?
still single-celled bacteria or whatever?
Well, we are descendants of prokaryotes.
Okay,
Ultimately, we're also descendants of eukaryotes and
but are
opisthecons.
we
And
are we still that?
by the definition, I mean, no, we're not.
Okay, so we are different than our ancestors.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I said. I said we're modifications
Right.
on our ancestors. We're not the same as our ancestors. We're modifications on them. That's that descent with modification. That's
Right. So we're different than each one of our ancestors, and you're slightly different than your parents, slightly different than your grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, I, I don't want to quibble about that one. That just seems it's a very strange thing to say.
what
Okay, if some very strange thing happened, like if a dog gave birth to like a golden egg or something, okay, then what's something realistically that could be done to show, if shown, would falsify Darwinism?
yeah, like I said, irreducible complexity and
Irreducible complexity. What else?
organisms jumping out of their clades, giving birth to totally new organisms. That would both of those would. I mean, off the top of my head, those are really the only two I can think of just on the spot right here.
Okay.
Someone said a vertebrate with a compound eye. Yeah, that'd be a weird one. That would be a weird one.
Didn't Jeff Goldblum years ago have that happen to him?
A what?
Jeff Goldblum, he was the fly.
What's he? Strange. I don't know.
I guess you're too young to know that reference.
Perhaps. Perhaps.
Look it up. It's a terrible movie. Um, so I guess to kind of wrap it up a little bit. Pretty much every single one of the papers that I was able to look up, I was able to find sound responses to, and the responses that you gave were as if this is me projecting, perhaps. So if I get your motivation wrong or whatever, I apologize. It seems as if like you felt like these were answers, and how embarrassing for anybody to say this. But
I'm
every
not sure
single
about embarrassing. I mean,
every
we all
single
get
one of
things
the
wrong.
papers that you listed, or nearly every one of them had responses to them and plausible explanations, and it didn't seem to be advancing the conversation forward at all. If that makes sense.
I mean, I don't really felt that way from what I've listed. I mean, I think that there was some misunderstandings about what cladistics is. I don't. I mean, having looked through his book, it doesn't really look like he was really playing fair with the data, or
Right.
always?
So the five things that I listed that you said were some of his oversights or gross misunderstandings. He skips the small shelly fossils. He talks about that in the book, in the appendix, as well as at length elsewhere. Phylogenetics, cladistics, cladograms. He talks about this as well as his colleagues at length, and every one of the arguments that were brought up are very very soundly dealt with. At least either they're very well dealt with, or he's a very good liar. Maybe that's the case. Um,
No, I'm not saying he's lying about anything.
I'm not either. I'm just you know it seems convincing to a layman, and that's all I am.
I mean, that's the point.
Um,
It's supposed to be.
but the exact same thing for you. Everything that you said sounds very convincing to a layman. But if you reference paper X, and I look at paper X, and it's saying very nearly the opposite of what you're claiming it's saying.
I don't think you
That's the
actually
index.
demonstrated that with regard to any of the papers that I showed. You said, well, it's this, but that doesn't really
I
matter.
haven't, and you're right. I haven't brought up many specifics. I was more just kind of trying to pick your brain and get some thoughts on.
I
some
mean,
of
the
things
researchers who are working in this field, like Valentine and Irwin and various others, none of them think that this is evidence of that there's any evidence of an intelligent designer sticking his finger in there. It's the only people who seem to be doing that are the non-paleontologists over here, kind of carping from the sidelines, which kind of raises a lot of red flags, and especially when you look at his work and you see that he's not putting these things in context.
Well, you have to find like some specifics. Like what specifically did he take out of context in order to say that?
Well, it's
People can say the same sorts of things about Darwin. Like, he was just a pigeon farmer. He was just an Anglican. He's just a this or that, or Unitarian, whatever he was. You can discount the man for his training, but I believe he does have training in geology and other related fields, and the experts that he talks with are experts in this field, and the papers that he cites are written by experts in the field, and even eminent experts that you list and recommend.
I mean,
So it's not like he's making this up or doing his own field research or anything like that that's at odds with the published literature. So it's hard to say that he's taking things out of context.
it kind of is at odds with the published literature, though. I mean, he's making this.
Well, the conclusion is different. Yes, the conclusion that he's drawing from the papers that these people write are different than the conclusions that the papers are writing. Yes, but we have to ask, why is that the case?
Why is he making this conclusion?
Why are they coming to different conclusions? Is it an evidential thing? Is it a logical thing? Are there errors in their logic?
If
you
read intelligent design work generally, yeah, it's very evidential. This is a group that says, I mean, you have to remember, Stephen Meyer's looking at this from his, and I'm not just discounting it because he's an intelligent designer. I'm trying to give an overview. Like I said, after all, I didn't discount what he said because he's an intelligent designer. After all, we did 2 whole freaking videos on it. So I'm not discounting him for just because he's so and so, right? Mm-hmm. Intelligent designers are looking at this from the perspective of, yeah, maybe there was some evolution, but we're not going to say what part of it was evolutionary. If when you look through their literature, they're very, like Behe, he can talk about what he thinks was designed all day. What wasn't designed? What is an actual evolutionary process, and how do you differentiate between these two? How do you differentiate a design event in the fossil record or whatever from a not design event?
I think you had at least one good idea if something was actually irreducibly complex. And that's his very point.
But they don't really talk about that. They don't really, but they won't answer that either.
Who doesn't?
The intelligent designers. They won't explain, like when I ask, what is different about the Cambrian and why are these two, why is one picked on but the other isn't?
I gave you like 3 quotes of why the Cambrian explosion is entirely different than all of these other radiations. You can't even call the Cambrian explosion a radiation except by stretching the term beyond all recognition. It's entirely different than all of these others that you've listed. So it's
and yet it has all the hallmarks of an evolutionary process. Even if you pull this one quote where they say that, fine, they say that, okay, but even still, it's like I said earlier, you have a bunch of different plausible explanations together. You have a sequential, or you have these features, which, while not necessarily chronological, they show a sequential sort of origination of these groups, and so it's and you have the soft-bodied organisms, and you have the shelly critters, and then you have the animals. Nothing about this looks like there was design intervention. Just saying, there are lots of clades that just came out of this time period. We don't know exactly why, but there are a lot of them. Mm-hmm. Nothing about that screams design. It just screams we don't know.
Apart from the design, before you look at a second suspect, can we eliminate the first suspect? Is that fair enough?
I mean,
apart from even if you and I don't agree on whatever a second hypothesis might be, does the hypothesis at hand account for it? I don't think so. Only when we gloss over it very quickly, like, oh, there's this thing without compound eyes, and
Valentine and Irwin aren't glossing over it. They're not
certainly they're not. But when you're saying that we can group these into different clades and crown groups and et cetera,
which is also what they do.
They do. I'm not discounting that, but when we look at it at a very high level like that, yes, it sounds very convincing. Just like if you sit down with a Mormon and talk about their
what
stuff,
about it sounds convincing?
The whole presentation, if I look at your video again, wow, this sounds very convincing. But if I look up in any one individual point, and I apologize for not being better prepared and looking at the specifics of, just being able to look at one point more in depth rather than kind of going all around. But anytime I look at just any one point that you make, like it just completely falls apart.
I mean, I can say the exact same of Meyer. When he doesn't put things in perspective, when he tries to disconnect all these things, it does look very nice to a layman, but
let's pick one. Let's pick one, and then maybe we can plan on talking more detail about that.
Let's pick the chordates, for instance. We see the chordates at the early chordates in the Cambrian explosion. You have Pikaia and Metaspergina, Hycoichthyes. You have these small, sort of lamprey-looking guys, and there's a proliferation of chordates. Towards the end of the Cambrian, you get the first jawless fish, then later the first jawed fish, then later the split between ray-finned and lobe-finned fish.
Okay, what specifically is the argument? Meyer failed to mention those, and had he mentioned those, it would have done
not
damage
necessarily
to his argument?
all those later, because those are occurring after the Cambrian. I'm talking about what part about this event. I mean, when you look at the Cambrian as a whole, it's a bunch of different events going on. And that's why I've repeatedly asked about this. Which are we talking about specifically? Because there's a radiation of panarthropods, and there's a radiation of, which is itself then broken down into stem lineages and crown lineages, and there's an extinction event separating those. There's a lot of different things going on. You can't just say, the whole thing.
So what specifically are they talking about? I think he references the Timoshan. I don't know if I'm saying that right, in Adabadian. That is 530 to 520 million years. That's what Irwin and Valentine reference as the Cambrian explosion, that brief interval. 530 to 520.
Which, I mean, even still, even just that part alone, that's 10 million years, which is still quite a long time for, which is both quite a long time for organisms and is, as in the papers I referenced, is not unusual. Sure, it's slightly,
I think it's something in the neighborhood of 5 times the rate of evolution that is seen elsewhere. Is that about what you saw?
That's not what I saw at all. No, they said it's slightly elevated but completely plausible rates of speciation. I didn't reference it. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. Let me see. Let me go back and find it, because I had the paper. I had the Come on, internet, work.
So the
Okay.
question is, if it was 10 million or 25 million or 250 million, how many more protein folds? How can we account for the genetic novelty and the epigenetic novelty that appears in the Cambrian? That's the question. How can we account for it?
I mean, have you
We're
taken a genetic sample of any of the? Yeah, I don't think
sorry.
anyone has. I don't think anyone's taken genetic samples from the Cambrian organisms. So that's kind of a complete question. I mean, you can look at the organisms we do have today and kind of figure out uh, a little bit. I mean,
Hmm.
you can look at the modern representatives and figure out who's related to who and what would have had to have changed. But looking at the fossils, no idea. No one can
Right.
make.
So these new organs, these new body plans, all of the new function and form that takes place, oxygen
Oh, here it
in
is.
the environment. Mhm.
I found the paper. Okay. This is a 2013 paper by Lee et al. The initial molecular analyses demonstrated that the observed rates of molecular evolution could be reconciled with divergences between metazoan phyla as recently as 586 million years ago, which, although still predating the Cambrian explosion, is now broadly congruent with recent discoveries of the earliest metazoans. Our
Is this the
results.
paper on that they did on arthropods?
This is rates of phenotypic and genomic evolution during the Cambrian explosion. This is a different paper than. Okay, yeah, anatomic. This is one you meant. I think you mentioned actually. Anatomical and genetic evolution occurred 5 times faster
Yeah.
during the early Cambrian. Okay,
Okay.
this and they even conclude, however, evolution. It was unusual and that fast rates are present, but that it was completely plausible.
Okay. So why is it plausible?
What about this isn't plausible?
No, what I'm saying is they're saying it's plausible. Okay, well, 5 times is plausible. 50 times, if say hypothetically they found it was 50 times. Oh, that's plausible. 500 times, that's plausible. Like why? On what basis do they make it plausible? The basis is they say well it happened, so it has to be plausible. It seems to be circular reasoning. Like
No, actually, the pattern is consistent with many Cambrian lineages exhibiting accelerated yet plausible rates of morphological and molecular evolution. Typical directional selection can increase phenotypic evolution rates by orders of magnitude over short timescales, and even conserved genomic regions can exhibit tenfold differences in evolutionary rates in living sister lineages. That's in living sister lineages. So you're
right.
talking.
So what accounts for?
So that was kind of the argument.
Go ahead and say it again.
I mean that if you're, it says even conserved genomic regions can exhibit tenfold differences in evolutionary rates in living sister lineages. You're talking about living sister lineages, so you're looking back at a time period over tens of millions of years, and it's only 5 times faster. So I really don't see a difference. I'm sorry. I don't see an issue there. I really don't see the issue. So
I feel like you're answering one question, and I'm asking a completely separate question.
you're
And,
asking
and
why
the,
do they find this plausible, right?
I'm asking, yes, in regards to that paper, I'm asking how do they account for there being this much genetic, this much additional genetic information that I know you have qualms about that phrase. Insert another phrase. There's new proteins. There's new protein folds. There's new genetic components required. There's new epigenetic components required. What mechanism accounts for all of this? Because it sure seems the neo-Darwinian mechanism just can't do anything near that
Why?
on
Why
that
does
kind
it
of
seem
time
that?
scale. Because the calculations that are made just it can't do anything. I think beyond families is what
According to who?
uh, I'll have to get you some references later.
Because that's not
I've
what this seems to be saying.
Well, I'm sure that's not what it seems to be saying. They're trying to explain away the Cambrian explosion,
I think
but they're
he's
they're
well.
they're they're
Explain
pre.
away is. Yeah.
Maybe that's not fair. I apologize. they're presupposing that this happened through natural selection, and then they're simply
Well, among
counting
other things.
backwards. They're simply counting backwards. Well, how many mutations would it? What was the rate of mutation that
Well,
it would have
right.
required?
This is something we talked about earlier. Is
Mm-hmm.
how do you is why is it that you accept the the half of it? Okay, yeah, this did happen. Yeah, there was a Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago, but none of the explanations for it make any sense. I mean, this it's rather weird. It's kind of weird from my perspective.
Okay, ask that again. I'm
Okay,
thinking about it.
well, instead of because the Cambrian seems to be sort of the issue here. Let's apply this differently. Let's say we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
the diapsid radiation of the Triassic. It's like imagine saying, yes, the diapsid radiation happened 250 million years ago, but there is no explanation for it. It's like that's kind of weird. I mean, there are a bunch of different explanations for it. There are all these, and there are studies on how.
Okay.
Why would we talk about how fast it's going if nothing else is really agreed upon? I mean, you either agree that it's happening at this rate. I think you agree it's happening at this rate. So the issue isn't really the rate. We both kind of agree it's happening 5 times,
No,
faster, right?
I agree that if it did happen that way, it would have required that rate. I'm sure the calculations are correct, but they're
Okay.
assuming they're assuming the point that I'm asking. They're begging the question that I'm asking. They're answering a different question, a very important question. If it did
Right.
happen
So
this way,
it's not really
how
relevant,
quickly?
right? So it's
Right.
not really relevant to our conversation.
This isn't an answer to the question I'm asking. That's why I said you're answering a question. Yes.
Well, that's what I'm
Elo-
saying. It's not
eloquently.
relevant to the question you're asking, right? You're
Right. But
asking a question about what has produced the biodiversity. So the
right.
rates don't matter, right?
Well, the rates do matter insofar as the neo-Darwinian mechanism, as far as I can tell, is inadequate in searching the required sequence space for these proteins, these protein folds.
But you
There
are.
isn't enough time to blindly search those sequence spaces. The
Well,
combinatorial inflation
did
is
you
much too
take a look
large.
at the papers regarding protein evolution that I presented?
I probably what was the name of it? I probably did. It's been a
I
couple
mean, there
weeks.
was a paper on. I talked about it we talked about it in greater detail in the creation of statistics video. But
What
the
was the author's name? It might refresh my memory.
um, well, this is a different paper. So, well, actually, oh no, dang it, go back, internet.
I think this is a very helpful conversation in that
Well,
I
the
I sorry, go ahead.
the point of the paper was that it's very
Mhm.
easy to evolve proteins. Like,
Okay.
it's very easy to evolve proteins was the point of the paper. They looked at evolving a recombinase into a protein that removes HIV.
Yeah, it is ringing a bell. I think I did look that one. There was some issue that I saw, some question that I want to ask you. I don't have it at hand. Um, it was HIV 1 or something like that, right?
Yeah, yeah. The overarching point though is that I mean here we go. Exploring protein fitness landscapes by directed evolution. Yeah, the point of it is that it's really not hard to evolve proteins. And actually, there was another paper that says the entire sequence space.
You said it was
Yeah.
exploring protein fitness landscapes.
Oh, by directed evolution. There was another paper we looked at that says the entire sequence space is totally explorable within the 4 billion years of evolutionary history.
Okay.
That was
Maybe that would be a good topic to talk about next time, because that's kind of an underlying assumption that both you and I have, that I say it isn't, you say it is. Well, if it is, then you're absolutely right, and if it isn't, then I'm right about that. So that's kind of an underlying kind of unstated assumption this whole time.
sorry, this is another one that I'll email you how to
Yeah,
get
go ahead
these
and email me.
papers for open access.
That'd be great, man. It's been a struggle trying to find a lot of these papers.
Well, with this new trick, you'll never look back. This one quick trick.
Um, So as I was saying earlier, the conversation is helpful. It just in me trying to organize my thoughts, and hey, this is the argument that you're using. This is the argument that I'm using, and I think most of this time we've kind of been talking in parallel, and our discussions haven't intersected much, unfortunately. I think that's mostly my fault. Um, so if we do talk again, I would like to. I'd like to have kind of a topic picked we can kind of narrowly discuss. Like maybe a list of paper, and we can discuss the strengths and drawbacks of that, and maybe actually make progress in one of these areas rather than jumping around and not really making any progress anywhere.
Okay. Okay.
Um, the next video that I'm wanting to make, I'd like to bounce off of you briefly if you have a second though too.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
It's about homology, both molecular and anatomically. What I've seen your videos of them, and I've seen the same problem in your videos that I see elsewhere when people are talking about homology. How is this? I guess briefly, how is this a good argument for evolution, and how is it not? Baldly circular reasoning, I guess, is kind of a blunt way to put it. I hope you know what I mean.
Well, when you're born, you have a certain set of characters, and you have the genes for those characters. Same as every other person in our entire species. They might have variations on that character. Well, if you look at the next closest, we know that speciation occurs. We know that variations can lead to speciation, and so then you can tell these two species are related to each other because we saw them speciate. So we know speciation's happening. We know that variations are happening.
Sorry, not so much what is homology as why do you feel it's a sound argument rather
that's where
than
I'm
a
going.
circular? Okay, I apologize.
So, well, don't take humans because we don't really have any close. Well, I mean, aside from our next closest relatives are a different genus, so take something else that has like different species alive today. So I talked in a recent video about the Italian wall lizard, Podarcus sicula. So you take that and its close relative Pimelis elensis. So both of these have we know these. We'll say we observe them speciating in the wild, whatever. So we know that they came from a common stock, and they have a lot of the same characters. We can sequence their genome. We can figure out what parts correspond to which genes, and so you have another. So we just found another species of Podarcus, and so you can keep doing this. We can figure out what features does this have in common, and what features are different, and you can just keep going outward from there to the next genus, the next family, etc. I don't think people, we can show that these features are the same in very closely related organisms or members of the same species, and you're just applying that, you're just extrapolating that outwards. I don't think it's circular. I mean, you can observe it happening.
Right. So when you can observe it happening, you can absolutely say yes, these are similar due to common ancestry. But when we can't observe it happening, then what stops it from being circular?
It's not circular. It's an extrapolation.
Right. But if common ancestry is baked into the definition of homology, and then homology is used as support for common ancestry, how is that not circular?
Well, so you look at like a cat and a human, for instance, and you look at their forelimbs, and you have to wonder, why do these organisms have the same bones in their forelimbs?
Right.
Well, it also turns out that they have the same sort of genetic signaling that corresponds to this. We know that one population can become different species, and that their variations build up in these different populations. And so the idea is that, given enough time, you can trace back the cat and the human to a common ancestor. I mean, we're taking processes that we observe, like, uh, you know, variations and novel mutations, things like that, and speciation, and you're just extrapolating backwards, and it seems very reasonable. You can make predictions about it. So I don't see what's really circular about that.
Well, for instance, in your video on homology, you said that organisms that are closely related to each other share many similarities in genetics and morphology. Yes.
I mean, yeah,
Homology.
you can see that though.
Sorry. Yes. I'm
Okay.
just saying what you said. Then you said, this is towards the beginning of the video. Homology is the state of having shared ancestry between two structures or genes in different taxa of organisms. I think that's pretty standard definition of homology, right?
I mean, yes, once you accept evolution, if you're a young Earth creationist, you don't accept homology. It's just a magical coincidence that a cat and a human have the same four-limb construction.
Okay.
I mean,
So,
if you read their work, that's what they say, basically. They don't
So-
say it's a magical coincidence, but...
right. Being facetious. So, is homology then evidence for evolution, or is it not? Because if you're saying it's only evidence for evolution if you already believe it.
I mean, it
So
helps... I would say that it helps to establish relationships.
How can it help to establish relationships unless we already know independently what those relationships are?
Well, Darwin didn't know. He had to figure it out. He had to figure out why, some organism, or not just him, Wallace also, he had to figure out, well, why do some organisms share characteristics in common? Why is it that we have more characteristics in common with cats than with frogs?
It's a good question, but
and that's sort of what has been, evolutionary theory has attempted to work out over the past century and a half, is why that is.
You're missing it, though. So you say homology is the state of having shared ancestry between two structures or genes in different taxa of organisms. Okay. And then at the end of the same video, you say homologies are produced because organisms are descended from ancestors that had genes coding for those structures.
Okay.
Common ancestry because common ancestry, in other words.
Well, the common ancestry is reached because of we know how populations split. It's really, once you understand the process of evolution, then we extrapolate backwards, and then you understand why why we have these structures in common.
So is it, in other words, homology is evidence for evolution only if you grant evolution, or is it homology isn't evidence for evolution then?
I mean, it kind of depends on what you mean by evolution. If you have these structures...
Common ancestry, let's say, common ancestry.
Is it evidence for common ancestry? Yeah. Because if you're, like I said, if you're grappling against, oh, interesting. Okay. If you're grappling with, why do organisms have the same parts, then I lost my train of thought because I looked at a comment. Sorry. If you're grappling with why organisms do have these same parts, then why is it? Is it because they were created separately with the same parts, or did they descend from common ancestor who also had these parts in common? That was kind of what Darwin was trying to figure out.
Right. Those are the two options.
Well, those are two options. I don't know if those are the two options.
No, those are two options.
Yeah. So you look at, and so we know that genetics, that certain genes are passed down. There are certain genes in populations. We know that populations split, and so it's just like I said. You're just extrapolating backwards.
Right, but do you not see the circularity though? If you have homology, if you have common ancestry in the definition of homology, you can't then use homology as support for common ancestry.
Here we go.
Do you follow?
Here, someone sent me this thing. They want me to read it.
Okay.
Homology is defined. It says the claim is homology is defined as similarity due to common ancestry. The claim then is that it is evidence for common ancestry is a circular argument. Here's the response. And homology is. This is from Talk Origins. I was just sent this. Homology is not defined as similarity due to common ancestry and then used as evidence for common ancestry. Rather, the evidence for common ancestry comes from the patterns of similarity of many traits. These similarities...
Can you pause there?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So the first sentence you said homology, common ancestry is not in the definition of homology and
They're
not
saying
used.
homology is not defined as similarity due to common ancestry and then used
Okay,
as evidence for common ancestry.
but you did.
I'm trying. Well, I haven't read this whole thing, so
Well, no, you did in your video. So 43 seconds, you defined homology as the state of having common ancestry. And then at the end of the video, you said homologies are produced because organisms are descended from common ancestors.
is the in
And that,
biology homology is the existence of shared ancestry between a pair of structures or genes in different taxa. Is that? I mean, that's. I believe that's similar to what we used.
right, it's a good definition, or it's a standard definition at least. So if you have common ancestry in the definition, can that definition be used to support common ancestry without being circular?
Well, you already
That's
accept.
almost the definition of circular reasoning, isn't it?
Well, no,
Unless
and
I'm missing
here's
something.
why. Everyone already accepts common ancestry to an extent. Okay, yeah, he says I need to continue reading, but then
Okay, go
I'll get
ahead.
back to that.
Sorry,
Second.
go ahead. I interrupted you.
Rather, the evidence for common ancestry comes from the patterns of similarity of many traits. These similarities show that organisms group naturally into a nested hierarchy. For example, the ladybugs and scarabs are both types of beetles is based on various common traits such as hardened front wings. Beetles, flies, and grasshoppers are types of insects. Insects, scorpions, and centipedes are types of arthropods. Such grouping does not depend on any assumptions about the origin and was in fact codified by Linnaeus, a creationist. A grouping suggested by many common traits is evidence of common ancestry. This is true no matter what you choose to call the traits. The homology label gets added after the evidence for common ancestry is already in.
Could you read the last 2 or 3 sentences again?
Okay, he's saying the homology label gets added after the evidence for common ancestry is already in. So what it's saying is you have organisms with these
Okay.
traits, but you don't call them homologous until after you have established that that trait is is caused by common descent.
Okay, so the answer then is homology is not an evidence for evolution, or more accurately, homology is not an evidence for common ancestry. You have to establish common ancestry
Sure,
independently.
sure.
So why in so many of your videos and so many biology textbooks is homology one of the very first evidences for evolution? So like if I heard the Talk Origins quote correctly, it was going fast. I'll look it up more in detail later.
Sorry.
That seems to be correct. If I'm understanding it correctly, homology is no evidence for evolution because it's assuming evolution, or it's assuming common ancestry in its definition.
Well, they're saying when they say it in the textbook, they recognize that these are homologous. They're saying that the structure that there are these common structures in a group, and that you look at their genetics and their morphology, and it shows that. And I mean, the best explanation is that they share a common ancestor. That is instead of being created separately.
Okay, so if there was some creationist textbook out there or website that was using circular reasoning, would you think that would be pretty embarrassing for them?
I mean, I just said that they are using
If
these
they
lines
did.
of evidence to figure out that these organisms are related, that they share common ancestry,
Right.
and then afterwards, the structures that they share in common are called homologous. That's not circular, right?
Right. It's not circular if you don't use homology as evidence for evolution.
Okay.
If you use common ancestry as the definition or include it in the definition and use it as evidence for evolution, then it's baldly
Right.
circular.
We've established that, right?
Okay. So if a creationist website or textbook had reasoning like that in there, hey, here's proof for creationism, here's proof for whatever silly thing. It was just this baldly circular argument. Do you think that would be embarrassing for them?
Are you saying I should be embarrassed by the video?
No, what I'm saying is there's this uncritical repetition, and believe me, I'm sure there's plenty of intelligent design and plenty of creationists, plenty of all sorts of people who do this. But the the most commonly cited evidences and things for evolution are often just uncritically accepted, like homology.
I think that's more of an explanation than a piece of evidence.
Well, it's frequently used as evidence, and you used it as one of the best evidences for
Then
evolution.
I misspoke in
Okay.
trying to explain it. So
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but that sort of thing is sort of a microcosm of the discussion. Like if you look up almost any evidence for evolution on YouTube, one of the very first things that you're going to find is, oh, homology is evidence for evolution, and it's defined
they
as common
proceed to
ancestry.
explain how we know that these structures are related to each other. They don't just stop. They don't just say they're
Well,
homologous.
obviously, yeah. They don't say common
Well,
ancestry
then,
because common ancestry
I
that would
mean, well,
be
then
obvious.
there's the explanation. I don't really see what the issue is.
Do you really not?
I mean, if they're saying here are these structures that all these closely related organisms, or that you have a bunch of organisms and they have structures and it forms a nested hierarchy. What is the best explanation for this? Well, we observe that organisms are born with variations in traits and that populations can speciate over time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so would you say the structure, we can observe that the structures in these two species that we observed, speciating from this one population, we can show that they're homologous now because we know
Right.
that they came from a common ancestor, right? But even if we didn't see their common ancestor, it's right. Like they're saying, yeah, we don't call them, or you shouldn't call them, homologous prior to the evidence. It's the It's that there is a twin nested hierarchy formed by these traits, both genetic and morphological, that
Okay. So
looks like evolution. If it doesn't,
right. So what they're saying is homology is not evidence for evolution. Evolution is evidence for homology. Or common ancestry. I'm using evolution and common ancestry interchangeably.
I mean,
apologize for
homologous
the
is more of
differences.
just an explanation of why these things are the same.
Okay.
Really, afterwards. So yeah.
Okay, so the point is that this is very much a microcosm of not everything, obviously, in the evolution debate, but many things like this are accepted uncritically, and the textbook says homology is great evidence for evolution, and then all these YouTube's videos say the same thing, and the evidence is like that or more common than one might think. They're accepted uncritically, just as objections to books like Darwin's Doubt. Somebody says, "Oh, he's plays fast and loose with the facts. He doesn't talk about this. He doesn't talk about that." When he and his colleagues go through great pains to answer every one of the points that you listed in the very beginning.
Doesn't seem like it.
Well, you haven't read it, to be fair, and you haven't read any of his colleagues' work, as far as I'm aware.
I mean, I have actually read a lot of intelligent design literature and young Earth creationist literature.
I'm sure you have. Those are two different things.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. Absolutely, no question.
So, right, just because, like, hey, I've talked to a biology teacher before, right? That's not.
I mean, I have read quite a bit of, not that book in particular. I mean, I don't think, even should I read his whole book,
You don't have
that's
to.
going to be
Like,
the nail in the
you don't need
coffin
to prove
for
anything to
I mean,
me about
the
it.
reason
But
is,
like, if you're going to say he doesn't talk about this, and like, here's
well, I
his
mean,
main
some things
weakness.
you acknowledge he didn't talk about. Really, he doesn't put these organisms in the context of their phylogenetic relationships, which is
Right, but the
kind of
appendix,
problematic.
the very first review that came out of his book was by undergrad Nick Madsky, and that was he raked Meyer over the coals for not talking about cladistics and how all of this, basically the exact same thing that you said,
Which
was almost word for word what this first critical review of his book was. And in the appendix of the book now, that's the very first thing that Meyer elaborates upon, and he explains why he didn't talk about it and why it doesn't matter. And in the other book, Debating Darwin's Doubt, I think there's like 6 or 7 chapters on that, and they go into great detail of why that's irrelevant and doesn't even start to answer the question that he's raising.
Well, no, see, this is one of those points where it's two different issues. You have to get an understanding of the context of this thing, but if you don't provide the context, then your readers are going to be left out and wondering, or they might be more likely to accept certain claims if you leave out facts of the matter. If you don't explain how these organisms are related, and you just kind of toss them out there as, oh, look at all these wonderful forms just kind of out of nowhere, well, then to the uninformed audience, that might seem like, oh, well, they are just coming out of nowhere. There's no explanation for this. But that's
Right.
not the issue. And that, as I pointed out, there is this transition. There are all these stem lineages that are leading up to the crown groups, even if they're not
Right.
perfectly chronologically ordered, which is not predicted by paleontologists anyway. So it's kind of a moot point. This is still what you should expect under evolution.
Well, let me agree with you there. I'm certainly not disagreeing. If Meyer or any writer or reviewer left out pertinent facts that would mislead somebody, that's shame on them. Honestly, shame on them. But he goes on to show it in the supplement to work that some of these things like the small shelly fossils he did leave out. He didn't. If I wasn't clear. He does talk about those briefly, both in the book and as well as in notes. Some of these arguments, but in the appendix he goes into great detail. Why this is irrelevant. It's not that this answers it and he left it out, and here's why he left it out. It's that it doesn't even begin to answer the question. It doesn't shed any additional light on it.
So I just did a text search in his book on shelly fauna, right? Or really just on shelly.
Yeah, small shelly fossils.
It does not appear in the body of the work.
I'll give you the
Here he goes. He says, okay, 73% of the way through. C. E. G. Cooper and 40 evolutionary explosions in the phylogenetic fuse. The Cambrian period is marked by the appearance of small shelly fossils consisting of tubes, cones, and possibly spines and scales of larger animals. These fossils, together with trace fossils, gradually become more abundant and diverse as one moves upward in the earliest Cambrian strata.
Right.
That's it. That's the whole of it, of what you get on this. I mean, what? Where's the explanation?
Okay, how is that misleading?
No, I mean that's it. That's not in the body of the work. That is outside of the body, and I'm inclined to agree with him there. But what does that have to do with anything? How is that an explanation? You made it sound like he just goes through these.
No, not that. He mentions small shelly fossils briefly in the text, and then he goes into much greater detail in the follow up to the work.
I mean, I'm looking at his text right now, and he does not do it in the body. Unless because I looked up the word shelly.
Darwin's Doubt is a 540 page book.
Yeah, and I'm doing a text search of it right now. I just looked up the word shelly, and it occurs 3 times in the entire book. In the endnotes. So
let's say he doesn't mention it at all. Is that a reason to discount it?
To discount the whole book? No, not on its own. But that's not what I'm saying either.
Okay, so why are we? What's the point of that objection then? How does that help shed light on anything?
Because this is part of the gradual progression that we're seeing. We see small, soft-bodied organisms. Then you have the diacrine fauna. Then you have the small shelly fauna, the little shelly critters, and then you see the larger shelly creatures later. So, I mean that is a step in the transition right there.
Okay,
it's
you're
like a
saying
step.
That this is a data point that was pertinent and left out.
Yeah.
Okay. If you're interested, I think it's free on the website. One of their websites. It's chapter 13 and chapter 14 of Debating Darwin's Doubt. The first one is called Small Shelly Fossils in the Cambrian Explosion, and the next one is more on small shelly fossils in the Cambrian Explosion. One is by Meyer, one is by Luskin.
So,
if you want to look up the responses to that.
So can I make a point? It's as you've said, he wrote a tome. He wrote a gigantic book.
Right.
He didn't really cover the whole thing very well, it appears.
What whole thing?
He didn't really cover the Cambrian explosion very well, it seems, from this gigantic book. He's leaving out steps. He's not connecting organisms.
Specifically, do you mean the small shelly fossils in cladistics?
It's not just that. I mean, we were talking about how Dickinsonia is an animal earlier. We were talking about, yeah, Cambriella is also an animal from the Ediacaran. But yeah, also Cladistics, which is kind of Cladistics is a major part of evolutionary biology. If we don't know how organisms are connected to each other, how do these how is it a Cambrian explosion at all if nothing's connected? What is the point?
Well, he does go into great detail talking about, at least I believe, Dickinsonia and a lot of these other animals, and why those are not good explanations in the Ediacaran fauna.
Not explanations for what?
For
I mean, these are just kind of showing that some of these groups were already there.
right, showing that these experts say that they're not bilaterians. They may not even be animals. They lack certain things that would exclude them from being any sort of precursor to many of these. They don't have certain things. I had to find the quote.
Well, I mean, like I said, Dickinsonia and Cambriella, as well as even the recently discovered Elingia, these are all.
I don't think he talks about Elingia.
Well, no, it was just discovered
okay.
like last week.
Okay, that'd be two reasons.
Oh no, absolutely. I'm just saying, it's another bilaterian that has been discovered from the Precambrian.
Yeah, and those are like great conversations to have. Like, hey, here's a new piece of evidence. Is this does this shift the balance one way or the other? Yes. If yes, great. If no, then fine. We'll keep looking. But to say that there's all of these misrepresentations and there's all of these things, and it's I know you didn't say this. It's easily debunked, but a lot of people do. It's very frustrating.
I'm not sure it's easily debunked. I mean, you have to steep into the technical.
I know
literature.
You didn't say that, but a lot of people, particularly professional reviews, they wave it away. They just kind of hand wave it away. They'll talk about one or two kind of side tertiary topics, and then not even address the main argument that he brings up. And even the side tertiary topics that they bring up, he'll deal with, or his colleagues will, and it's just a non-point. So it's very frustrating to have it portrayed, to have an argument that seems sound portrayed as, oh, this is flat eartherism, or this is anti-vax business, right? When it's at least it seems to me, being a layman, that it seems to be a serious piece of science, and when it's dealt with in this manner, it doesn't make me doubt Meyer's work. It makes me doubt the judgment of the person who's waving it away, like someone like what's the guy who wrote Why Evolution is a Coin. He does this kind of stuff a lot. Mm-hmm. It makes me doubt that he understands the arguments, or that he wants to even engage with it. So that's frustrating, and I appreciate that you didn't do that.
Well, yeah, because that's not going to help anybody.
It doesn't. And honestly, like I said at the beginning, I would prefer if evolution was true, but I'm not going to accept it based on lazy arguments. Mm-hmm. And again, I know everybody on all sides does this. Nobody's innocent in that, but if it's going to be portrayed as this, well-reviewed, peer-reviewed, body of science, then let's make sure if we're saying this paper shows that developing new proteins is easy peasy. And if I look at this, and I recall looking at it, and there were some substantial holes in it that I think need to be discussed. It's not as simple as is portrayed sometimes.
Well, that's a little. Oh man,
what did I say?
No, it's nothing you said. No, I hear you. I absolutely
okay.
I agree with you. I'm just I was looking at actually, this might be a good. This might make for a good video. Mm-hmm. I was just opened up to chapter 13 and 14 of his of the debating Darwin's doubt. And I'm already seeing some issues, so this actually could be a fun video.
Great, yeah, great. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
I mean, just look at
it's very difficult to find people who are engaging with it.
I mean, look at the very first page of this. It's Casey Luskin writing about how it said that by this guy Charles Marshall that Stephen Meyer completely omits mention of the early Cambrian small shelly fossils, and then Casey Luskin quotes from the endnote this one reference. Really? Come on.
What?
He quotes that the section, this tiny piece of a paper that which is not wrong. It's right that Meyer quotes in the endnotes or the references, I guess, really not necessarily the endnotes.
Mm-hmm.
He left out the he doesn't say anything in the body of the book, and he leaves it to a tiny paragraph which doesn't either say anything, which he doesn't say anything for or against.
What's the problem, though?
Oh man, that's not even an argument. I was reading. It's like what.
Well, it's not an argument. He's simply correcting that Marshall said he completely leaves out. And he says, "Well, actually, he doesn't." Then he
Well,
goes.
yeah,
Then he makes his argument.
He spends 3 sentences mentioning that small shelly fossils exist, but not really anything about them. So great, I guess.
Do you know? Do you know that when you were reviewing my video, you said something like, "Wait a second, Darwin died. Before this time, he couldn't have possibly talked to so and so." Do you remember
Well,
that?
small shelly fauna were known about before Meyer wrote Darwin's Doubt, so he had access to the literature.
No. What I'm saying is, I don't know if you're in a position to be nitpicking about something like that when Luskin is actually correct about that. That's not his argument. He's simply correcting Marshall's misobservation. So, like,
I mean, he's right with
let's
regard
avoid.
he's right with regard to the body of the book, though. He doesn't actually. Look, you're right.
Yeah, let's avoid getting too nitpicky. Like, yeah, you're right. Darwin died. I was using it as a device, and Watson Crick didn't literally beat up DNA with aluminum bats to get it.
Well, that wasn't really my issue. I mean,
I know, but it's that kind of thing. Like, let's get to what the point is, and let's get to the argument, and let's avoid.
But even still, again, a 500-page book, and he devotes a paragraph, which in the references, which has nothing to do really with his argument. I mean, that's
regardless. Luskin is right about that. I think you're right. It's nitpicky. We could just skip over it. If I was reviewing Marshall's thing, I would say, yeah, fine. Should have talked about it.
Oh,
Here's
I
the
can
answer.
do this very easy. Okay. Oh, okay. I was like, how do I turn the page on this thing? Okay, I figured it out. Hooray! I figured it out. How to turn the page. Go me. All right. Well. This could be interesting. It's not very long.
Yeah, and that one and the one by Meyer himself, the follow-up to that, it's short. It's like 2 or 3 pages. I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because it's shockingly difficult to get anybody to honestly engage with the argument, rather than like getting sidetracked on nitpicky things or like calling names or doing all the silly stuff. I want to get to the truth of the matter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll definitely be interested to take a look at that. I will save this. I'll definitely save this for later.
Okay. And in particular, I think the first like 7 or 8 chapters of the book deal with all the problems with crown groups and all of this, and cladistics and all the
problems with crown groups. That's
the problems that were raised by Matsky and a lot of these things that are perceived. They're answering other.
I mean, if it's again the bit about, well, they weren't exactly in that. Well, they weren't like chronologically there. Well, that's not really the issue. That'd be kind of a misdirection.
No, it goes into detail about a lot. Go ahead and read it if you want. We can chat more later.
We also have a question from the audience for you. He says, "Can we?" Let's see. Okay, so Nestlig keeps asking me about the 1993 paper by Irwin and Bowring. What about it?
Meyer does reference that one. I believe you and I did talk about that.
No,
too.
yeah. I think I referenced it we referenced it in the in the video. So Nestlig, what's the problem with it, or what do you have to say about it? I guess. Drop us a line only at Jackson channel /how it's made. Okay. He cites that for his 6 to 10 million year time frame for the explosion. Okay. Yeah, I remember that. What about it? LSS. I don't know what you mean by that. What about it, Nestle? Type faster.
Is there a delay?
No, I don't think so. I think it's actually the internet's been decent this whole time. I haven't seen people screaming about the buffering, so
Oh, do you turn into like a robot voice when it lags on you?
sometimes, sometimes. It happened with the talk I did with a guy yesterday. Oh, he said, long story short, it's outdated. See Google Hangouts. Oh, okay, wait.
It's outdated. That's fine.
Well, I mean, that's... Okay. Uh, he said, Jackson, quoting from Bowring, 1993, analysis of the Cambrian faunal radiation indicate that diversification followed a logistic pattern of increase. Our calibration shows that the initial Manichaean interval of slow diversification followed the Ediacaran faunal epoch by no more than 20 million years and lasted approximately 14 million years. In contrast, if we accept the age of 525 million years for the Adebanian-Batomian boundary, then the Timoshan Adebanian period of exponential increase of diversification lasted only 5 to 6 million years. In any event, it is unlikely to have exceeded 10 million years. Okay? Close quote. Note that there was an initial slow diversification of 14 million years before the exponential increase of 5 to 6 million years. That's already 20 million years in total. And what's more, note that they accept an age of 525 million years for the boundary. The paper was from 1993. The Adebanian-Batomian is now dated to 516 million years. So the exponential increase lasted from 530 to 516, which is 14 million years. So it's 28 million years in total.
Okay.
So not really 5 million years, but even still. There you go, Ness. Are you happy now? I read it. There you go. Okay. Yeah, more recent paper. It seemed like all the more recent papers I were looking at said like 20 to 30 million years, or more than that. But and that's just that's the Cambrian explosion. That's not the entire Cambrian period, or before the Cambrian. That's just the body of the explosion. But at any rate, okay, we've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I've clarified some things that I think will help in moving forward.
Okay, yeah, thank you again. Thank you so much for coming on. I always enjoy these types of conversations. I'm very happy. Thank you. Yeah, thanks again. Thanks everybody for watching. Thanks. Long story short, I will have your channel in the description. I'll do that shortly, right as soon as it shuts down. So, okay, all right. Thank you again. Thanks everybody for watching. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye.
All right.